The nights during the Ice Age were nothing short of merciless. Imagine the kind of cold that seeps not just into your bones, but into your very sense of hope. When every breath you exhaled crystallized in the darkness, and the air itself seemed intent on extinguishing life. For our ancestors, winter was not just a season to endure. It was a test of whether their ingenuity and cooperation would be enough to see the next sunrise. Fire offered a glow. Yes, but fire was fickle, easily smothered by damp wood or fierce winds that slipped through crude shelters. Furs helped, but they only went so far when the air inside the caves could drop below freezing. And so survival sometimes came from an unexpected ally. There, on those frozen nights, when silence reigned except for the crackling of burning wood and the whisper of snow outside, humans found warmth, protection, and even companionship in the presence of wolves. That bond was not immediate, nor was it inevitable, but over thousands of years it became one of the most profound relationships in human history. Before we dive into the heart of this story, let me pause for a moment. If you're settling in with this video, maybe lying in bed or closing your eyes as you listen, I want you to do something for me. Tap that subscribe button so you don't miss the next journey back into prehistory. And just for fun, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. Are you drifting off at midnight in New York? Or maybe it's the quiet of early morning in Tokyo. I love knowing that these stories connect us across time zones, across places, across the world itself, much like the cavemen huddling together under the stars, united by the need for warmth and connection. Now, with that out of the way, let's sink back into the icy depths of prehistory. The image of a caveman lying side by side with a wolf might sound romanticized, almost too cinematic to be true, but archaeological evidence has long suggested that humans and wolves were interacting thousands of years before the domesticated dog trotted into our lives. The earliest hints of this relationship date back roughly 30,000 to 40,000 years when wolf remains have been found buried near human settlements, sometimes even treated with what looks like ritual significance. This tells us that at the very least there was respect. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Wolves, like humans, are social creatures reliant on the pack for survival. Both species hunted in groups relied on cooperation and respected hierarchy. But beyond these shared instincts, there was something even more pressing. Both humans and wolves were freezing, shivering, and desperate to endure the winter nights. For early humans, bringing a wolf close was not without danger. These were not tame animals in the modern sense, and the line between ally and predator was razor thin. A wolf could turn hostile if threatened, hungry, or startled, and one wrong move could spell disaster for a small, vulnerable clan. Yet necessity often drives risks, and when the temperature plummeted, there was no room for hesitation. Perhaps it began with a wolf lingering near a campfire's edge, attracted to the smell of meat or the radiant warmth. Over time, the distance shortened. The wolf didn't attack. The humans didn't chase it away. A fragile understanding began to bloom in the frost-bitten silence. The night no longer held just fear. It now contained the faint heartbeat of possibility. What made wolves particularly suited to this strange partnership was their own biology. Wolves are built for cold in a way that humans could only envy. Their thick double coat insulates them against snow and wind, while their body heat radiates a steady warmth when pressed close to others. In a communal sleeping arrangement, whether it was wolves with wolves or wolves with humans, the pile became a furnace against the cold. Imagine a small group of people huddled under furs with 2 or 3 wolves pressed against their sides. The air might be freezing, but in that cocoon of breath and warmth, survival chances skyrocketed. This wasn't affection at first. It was biology, strategy, and raw necessity. But survival often lays the groundwork for deeper bonds. Over generations, the relationship deepened. Wolves that were less aggressive, more curious, and more tolerant of humans found themselves rewarded with scraps of food, proximity to warmth, and ultimately survival. Those wolves survived the winters better than their more feral cousins. Humans, too, benefited not just from the warmth, but from the sharp ears and keen instincts of their nocturnal companions. A wolf stirred at the faintest sound in the darkness long before a human would notice. In this way, wolves became living alarm systems, guardians of the night, partners in the battle against both cold and danger. Each night spent in that precarious partnership carved the first lines in a story that would eventually reshape the destiny of both species. And so what began as cautious coexistence on bitter winter nights slowly transformed into something more profound. By sleeping side by side, by surviving together through storms and hunger, humans and wolves were unknowingly weaving the earliest threads of domestication, of trust, of shared destiny. It was not just about comfort nor just about safety. It was about resilience, about finding allies in unexpected places, and about the undeniable truth that in the harshest environments, survival often depends on who or what you allow into your circle. This is where our journey begins, and in the next part, we'll dive deeper into those early winters before the wolves drew close. When humans faced the cold with nothing but fire, fur, and fragile hope, long before wolves drew close to human fires, our ancestors had to rely on their own fragile inventions to hold back the fury of winter. Imagine the first moments of nightfall, when the sun slipped behind the icy horizon and shadows stretched across the land. The air would grow so still and so sharp that every inhalation stung like needles. For these early people, the day was a scramble to gather what meager resources they could. Branches that hadn't yet frozen solid, scraps of meat left over from a hard hunt, clumps of moss to stuff into gaps of their shelters. As the world outside turned white, and the wind began to howl, they retreated into caves, pits, or lantos made of wood and bone. The shelters were crude, their walls unable to keep out the drafts, their roofs barely holding against snow. Fire was the one constant, a glowing core that promised life. Yet fire demanded constant feeding, and feeding it required a dangerous dance with the cold each time someone ventured out to collect fuel. The nights were endless, heavy with fear, and every flicker of flame felt like a wager against death itself. What's striking is how little stood between those people and extinction. Their clothing, stitched from hides with bone needles, offered some insulation, but leather stiffened in the frost, and wet furs became heavy burdens instead of comfort. Archaeological evidence from Ice Age sites shows signs of wear and patching on clothing, proof that people fought to stretch every scrap of hide into usefulness. When huddled together in shelters, they created warmth with body heat, a trick that is still known to mountaineers today. Families curled against one another. Elders pressed close to the young, sometimes with little more than a smoldering branch left over from the day's fire to push back the dark. It was survival at its rawest, intimate, precarious, and desperate. Without wolves, without any other allies, the night was an enemy they faced alone. In these conditions, imagination became both a curse and a lifeline. As the winds shrieked through gaps in rock or bone huts, the human mind filled the darkness with shapes and fears. What if a predator lurked outside, waiting for the fire to die? What if the snow collapsed the roof of their fragile shelter? These weren't just idle anxieties. They were grounded in harsh reality. Remains of cave lions, hyenas, and saber-toothed cats found near human settlements remind us that danger prowled constantly at the edges of firelight. The act of falling asleep was itself an act of courage. To close one's eyes meant trusting that the shelter would hold, that the fire would endure, and that someone, usually a blurry-eyed watchman, would shake them awake if danger approached. And yet, even in those brutal nights, humans survived. They adapted, enduring what seemed impossible, carving out just enough warmth to see another sunrise. Evidence from archaeological digs tells us that some groups experimented with more elaborate shelters, using mammoth bones as frameworks and layering hides for insulation. In Ukraine, sites like Mesri show huts made of mammoth tusks and bones dating back roughly 15,000 years. Imagine how much work it took to drag those massive remains into place, to bind them into walls that could withstand howling winds. Inside, people could huddle closer, their fires reflecting on ivory surfaces, creating a glow that must have felt almost magical against the bleak expanse of snow outside. These shelters weren't luxurious, but compared to crouching in a shallow cave, they represented an astonishing leap forward. They were proof of human ingenuity, the refusal to surrender to the elements. Even before wolves joined them, humans were testing their limits, building fortresses of bone and fur in defiance of the cold. Still, for all their creativity, survival was fragile. A fire too small meant frostbite. A fire too large risked consuming precious fuel or suffocating everyone inside with smoke. Food ran out quickly, and hunger gnawed louder than the wind outside. Skeletal remains from the period show signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, and even marks suggesting cannibalism in extreme cases. Winter wasn't simply a backdrop to life. It was the central challenge. The ultimate test of endurance to make it through the long, endless nights was to prove one's place in the unyielding cycle of survival. The idea of having an ally, another heartbeat in the dark, another body radiating warmth would have seemed like a dream. Yet those alliances had not yet formed, and the people of that era bore the burden alone, generation after generation, with only the stubborn flame of fire and the closeness of kin to sustain them. And it's here in the heart of this fragile existence that the story begins to shift. For as much as humans adapted, as clever as they became, there remained gaps. Moments when ingenuity faltered and cold pressed too deep. It was in these cracks of desperation, in the silence of frozen nights, that wolves began to appear on the edges of firelight. They were not yet companions, not yet trusted. But their presence was undeniable, drawn by the smell of meat, the heat of flames, or perhaps the same primal yearning for survival. Wolves circled closer to human shelters. At first, they were the embodiment of fear, eyes glowing in the dark, silhouettes haunting the snow. But slowly, over countless winters, the line between threat and possibility began to blur. In the next part, we'll step into that uncertain space when the first encounters between man and wolf set the stage for one of the most extraordinary partnerships in the history of life on Earth. It must have started with a pair of eyes, glowing faintly just beyond the flicker of firelight. For early humans, those eyes could belong to any number of predators, lions, hyenas, or wolves. But the reaction was the same. Fear, tension, hands clutching spears fashioned from bone and stone. Wolves had always been hunters in their own right, capable of tearing down prey much larger than a man. Their presence at the edge of camp was not welcomed. It was a reminder that the darkness was alive with creatures equally desperate to survive. Yet over time, something curious unfolded. The wolves didn't always attack. Sometimes they lingered, pacing the perimeter, watching. They smelled the meat roasting over the fire, the bones discarded just outside the shelter, the smoke curling into the frozen air. What began as weariness slowly gave way to curiosity on both sides. For humans, the realization dawned that not every shadow was a threat, and for wolves that not every fire spelled danger. At first, the interactions were indirect, almost accidental. A carcass left behind by hunters might be picked clean by wolves once the people moved on. Bones scattered at the edge of camp heavy with marrow became easy pickings for hungry jaws. There is archaeological evidence, in fact, of gnaw marks on bones found near early human settlements. Marks that match the teeth of wolves. This suggests a form of scavenging relationship where wolves benefited from human leftovers and humans gained little more than a temporary reprieve from the cold, knowing the wolves might be less inclined to attack while their hunger was satisfied. In this fragile balance, both species learned to read the other, to recognize the signals of aggression versus tolerance. The wolves that did not immediately attack survived longer around human settlements, and the humans, who didn't kill every wolf on sight, began to notice patterns. Some wolves were less dangerous, more cautious, almost cooperative. The nights must have been filled with tension during those first encounters. Imagine a family curled in a cave, the firelight dancing on rough stone walls as the low, throaty growl of a wolf echoed outside. Spears at the ready, hearts pounding, they waited for the moment when shadows would break into attack. Yet sometimes the growl never turned into violence. Instead, the wolves lingered, keeping their distance, their yellow eyes glinting as they watched. The humans, too exhausted to waste energy chasing them off, began to accept their presence. A stalemate formed. Humans provided scraps intentionally or not, and wolves hovered like silent sentinels. For both sides, this was not trust. Not yet, but it was a beginning. A quiet agreement born in the howling winds of winter that neither side could afford to squander. It is easy to underestimate how profound this step was. For countless generations, humans had viewed predators as enemies, and wolves were among the most feared. They could stalk prey with uncanny endurance, run down exhausted animals for hours, and tear flesh with frightening efficiency. And yet, in the dance between hunger and survival, a subtle shift occurred. the wolves that did not lash out immediately, that tolerated proximity to humans, gained scraps and warmth. The humans in turn began to see the benefit of their presence. Wolves were sharp-eyed, sharp-eared. They sensed danger long before humans did. A pack of wolves circling near camp might drive away other predators, leaving humans strangely safer by their very existence. Whether they realized it or not, the wolves were becoming an accidental security system, their growls warning of threats in the night long before human ears could catch them. One of the most compelling aspects of these early encounters is how they reveal the capacity for both species to adapt behavior. Wolves that were too aggressive would have been driven off or killed. Wolves that were more tolerant, less fearful, lingered generation after generation. In turn, humans slowly adjusted their instinct to treat every predator as a deadly enemy. Over thousands of years, this selective pressure shaped the path forward. It wasn't planned. No ancient hunter sat down and said, "Let's domesticate wolves." Instead, it was the small incremental choices, the decision not to chase off a scavenger, the offering of a leftover bone, the hesitation to strike when a wolf didn't attack that built the fragile foundation of coexistence. And in those first winters, when the nights stretched unbearably long and fire alone could not keep away the cold, that coexistence proved more valuable than anyone could have imagined. By the time these encounters became more frequent, the pattern was set. Wolves would circle clothes in the snow, waiting for scraps, their breath steaming in the frigid night, while humans huddled by the fire, spears in hand, but increasingly at ease with their shadowy visitors. The barrier between fear and familiarity had been crossed. These were not yet compions, but neither were they simple threats. They were something in between, something new. The wolves' watchful eyes mirrored human curiosity. And in those long nights of ice and silence, a bond was being tested. What began as chance meetings at the edge of firelight would in time blossom into one of the most extraordinary partnerships in history. And in the next part, we'll explore how archaeological evidence from burial sites to ancient remains gives us tangible clues that this fragile dance between human and wolf was not just legend, but reality etched into the bones of time. When we talk about the relationship between humans and wolves in prehistory, it's easy to imagine it as a story told around campfires woven into myths and oral traditions. But the remarkable thing is, we actually have hard evidence, bones, burials, and artifacts that give weight to these ancient whispers. Archaeologists have unearthed wolf remains dating back over 30,000 years, often in contexts that suggest more than mere coincidence. One of the most striking examples comes from a site in what is now Belgium, where the skull of a wolf was found buried alongside human remains, carefully placed in a way that resembles ritual. This was no careless discard of an animal carcass. It was deliberate, suggesting respect, connection, even reverence. Such burials hint that wolves were not simply predators lurking on the periphery, but had crossed a threshold into the human sphere. They mattered enough to be given a place in the sacred rhythm of life and death. Perhaps the most famous find is from Pravosti in the Czech Republic, a site dating back around 27,000 years. There, archaeologists discovered the remains of what appear to be domesticated wolves, sometimes referred to as proto-dogs. What makes this discovery fascinating is not only their proximity to human remains, but also the way some skulls showed signs of wear, consistent with being handled, possibly even used as ritual objects. One skull had a mammoth bone carefully placed in its jaws, as though someone had taken the time to stage it deliberately. This suggests that wolves had taken on a symbolic role in the lives of these early people, a role that went beyond the practical. They were no longer just scavengers tolerated at the edge of campfires. They were woven into the fabric of human meaning, honored in death as they may have been in life. And then there's Bonn Oberkassel in Germany, one of the most famous early dog burials in the world, dated to about 14,000 years ago. There, a wolf-dog hybrid was found buried with a man and woman as though part of the family. Careful analysis of the animal's bones revealed that it had suffered from a serious illness while still alive, one that would have required care to survive. In other words, humans must have tended to this animal, feeding it, protecting it, ensuring it lived through its sickness. That kind of effort makes no sense unless there was affection, trust, and recognition of value. The humans had invested not just scraps, but care into the life of a creature that was no longer simply wild. In that moment, you can see the bond stretching across millennia, from a sick wolf dog cradled by its clan to the pet lying beside you today. These sights reveal that the relationship was not sudden nor uniform. It wasn't as though one day all wolves became friendly companions. Instead, different groups of humans across vast stretches of Europe and Asia were experimenting, sometimes consciously, sometimes simply by necessity, with this strange partnership. Some groups may have rejected wolves entirely, killing them outright. Others tolerated them as scavengers, and a few, perhaps by luck or vision, nurtured the connection, allowing the more docile animals to linger, feed, and eventually share warmth in the coldest nights. Archaeology captures only glimpses of this process. But even those glimpses are powerful because they remind us that what seems obvious to us now, that humans and dogs belong together, was once an unthinkable leap. It is worth pausing to consider just how radical that leap was. Wolves were apex predators, skilled hunters that competed directly with humans for food. By inviting them into camps, people were taking a gamble, and yet the gamble was clearly worth it. Over thousands of years, the wolves that thrived near humans began to change, skulls shifting in shape, jaws narrowing, temperaments softening. These are the very first steps of domestication, etched into fossil record. Humans too changed. We began to think differently about our place in the natural world, about alliances that cross the species barrier. To bury a wolf, to care for a sick animal, to treat it as kin, was to redefine what survival meant. It wasn't just about enduring the cold anymore. It was about forging new kinds of bonds, ones that made survival not only possible but richer, safer, more interconnected. And so by the time winter descended with its suffocating snow and silence, some clans were no longer facing it alone. They had wolves at their sides. Not as equals yet, not fully as comps, but as something new, something in between. The archaeological evidence stands as a testament to this transitional moment in history when necessity gave birth to trust, and trust was immortalized in bone and ritual. In the next part, we'll explore the shared dangers of those winters. Not just the cold, but the predators, the hunger, the rival groups that made wolves and humans realize they were better off together than apart. Winter in the Ice Age was not a quiet affair. Yes, the snow muffled sound, and yes, the night stretched an eerie silence, but beneath that stillness lay constant danger. The cold alone could kill, but it was far from the only enemy. Packs of cave hyenas prowled the frozen plains, scavenging and hunting in numbers that sometimes dwarfed human groups. Cave lions, larger and more formidable than their modern descendants, stalked the same game that humans depended on. And in the distance, the low rumble of a mammoth herd reminded everyone that even prey could be deadly if provoked. For small bands of humans huddled in their shelters, these dangers were magnified by vulnerability. A single cave lion slipping into camp, a pack of hyenas emboldened by hunger. Any of these could wipe out an entire family line in a single night. Wolves, too, faced the same predators, the same starvation, the same bone-shattering winds. It was here in the shared crucible of danger that the unlikely partnership between humans and wolves found its footing. One can imagine the tension in those nights when the sound of distant howls carried across the icy expanse. To some, it must have been a signal of threat, but to others, it may have been a strange kind of comfort. After all, wolves howling nearby often meant that other predators were keeping their distance. Wolves themselves were formidable, but their territorial behavior could serve as an invisible fence against hyenas or lions. Humans may have realized this over time, noticing that their camps were less likely to be attacked when wolves lingered nearby. This wasn't protection in the sense we think of it today. It wasn't loyalty or affection, but it was a form of unintentional alliance. The wolves were asserting dominance over their space, and humans by sheer proximity benefited. Food scarcity drove much of this interaction. In the lean months of winter, when game was scarce and snow buried everything edible, both humans and wolves walked a knife's edge between survival and starvation. They were competitors, yes, but also mirrors of each other. Wolves ran down prey with endurance. Humans stalked with strategy and tools, and sometimes both failed. The wolves who lingered near humans often gained scraps from successful hunts, while humans might follow wolf tracks to find weakened prey. Over time, these overlaps blurred the line between competitor and collaborator. A wolf might trail a hunting party not to threaten it, but to scavenge what was left. A human might tolerate that presence, not because of generosity, but because the wolf's hunger didn't diminish the hunt. It just consumed what would otherwise be discarded. Each side learned painfully and gradually that the other wasn't always a rival. Sometimes they were simply two branches of the same struggle, clinging to life in the same frozen wasteland. What made wolves particularly valuable in this dangerous landscape was their vigilance. Unlike humans who needed deep sleep to recover from the exhaustion of hunting and gathering, wolves seemed always on edge, their ears twitching at the faintest sound, their noses catching scents carried for miles by the winter wind. Archaeological studies of campsites suggest that humans often rotated night watch duties. But imagine the relief of knowing that an animal was always awake, always listening, even while the humans slept. A wolf that growled at a shifting shadow might buy a family precious seconds to grab their spears. In this way, wolves became guardians. Not intentionally, not out of loyalty at first, but out of instinct. Their need to survive meshed with human need. And together, both species found themselves a little safer in the dark. Rival humans were another danger lurking in the snow. Bands of hunter-gatherers competed fiercely for territory, food, and resources. A cave filled with stores of meat or a firelit shelter could be irresistible to desperate outsiders. Conflict between groups was inevitable, and it was often violent. Here again, wolves may have played an indirect role in defense. Their presence, their noise, their unpredictability could deter would-be attackers who feared being mauled in the chaos. To stand at the mouth of a cave and hear not only the hiss of fire, but also the growl of wolves must have given pause to any intruder. Wolves were not loyal soldiers at this stage, but they were a deterrent, another layer of danger between humans and the outside world. In a winter where everything was trying to kill you, an extra barrier of teeth and fur was no small blessing. So it was in these shared dangers, cold, predators, hunger, rivals, that the seeds of partnership sprouted. Both wolves and humans realized in their own ways that life near each other was safer than life apart. For the wolves, scraps of meat and protection from larger predators made the risk worthwhile. For the humans, the watchful eyes, sharp senses, and sheer presence of wolves created a buffer against the harshest realities of winter. Survival was never guaranteed, but with wolves circling close, the odds tilted just slightly toward life. And in the Ice Age, even the smallest tilt meant everything. In the next part, we'll step away from danger and into psychology. How trust, tentative, fragile, and revolutionary, began to grow between species that once only knew each other as enemies. Trust is one of those things we take for granted today. When a dog rests its head on your lap or curls at your feet without hesitation, but for our ancestors and their wolf counterparts, trust was a dangerous gamble. Both species had sharp teeth. Both knew the cost of vulnerability, and both understood that one wrong move could mean death. For a wolf to step closer to the fire, to settle near the scent of humans, was to risk being speared or driven away. For a human to allow that wolf to linger was to risk a sudden lunge in the night. And yet, against all odds, small gestures began to shift the balance. Perhaps it started with a scrap tossed toward the darkness, not out of generosity, but practicality. Better to lure the wolf away from the camp than to risk it attacking. The wolf, cautious but hungry, edged forward, snatched the offering, and withdrew. Nothing happened. No attack, no chase, just a transaction, repeated again and again until it became a ritual. Over time, these moments accumulated into something deeper. The wolves that approached cautiously with lowered posture, ears flattened or tails tucked, showed signals of submission that humans instinctively recognized. Anthropologists believe these early signals were key to bridging the species divide. Wolves that displayed less aggression survived longer near humans, while the bold, reckless ones were killed or driven off. Humans, in turn, learned to distinguish between threatening behaviors and signs of tolerance. This mutual reading of body language was the first vocabulary of trust. A growl softened into silence when scraps were given. A spear remained lowered when the wolf retreated instead of lunging. In those fragile seconds, millennia of instinct were bent ever so slightly toward cooperation. Trust deepened in moments of desperation. Imagine a night when the fire burned low and food was scarce. A wolf might settle nearer to the camp, drawn not just by hunger, but by warmth radiating from the bodies huddled together. The humans, exhausted beyond vigilance, might have tolerated the closeness out of sheer fatigue. And then came the realization the wolf didn't attack. It curled beside them, or at least nearby, its breath steaming in the cold, its fur radiating warmth. In that moment, fear gave way to recognition. The wolf was not only tolerable, it was useful. The line between enemy and ally blurred further. The first time a human child fell asleep with the soft sound of a wolf's breathing nearby must have been surreal, almost unthinkable. Yet once that barrier was crossed, there was no going back. Psychologists today would call this a process of desensitization, where repeated exposure to a perceived threat slowly reduces fear. But for Ice Age humans and wolves, it was more than that. It was survival psychology at work. Both species were highly social, wired to read cues from group members, to recognize loyalty and betrayal. That wiring made it possible to extend the circle of trust just enough to include the other. Wolves, accustomed to hierarchies and pack dynamics, may have slotted humans into their mental framework as dominant leaders or as part of an extended pack. Humans accustomed to kinship and cooperation began to see wolves not only as scavengers, but as watchful neighbors, guardians, and eventually companions. This was not affection in the modern sense. It was pragmatic trust born of repeated proof that the other side would not betray them. Archaeological evidence adds weight to this psychological journey. Studies of wolf and protodog remains show gradual changes in skull shape, jaw size, and tooth wear over thousands of years, all pointing toward animals that were slowly adapting to life alongside humans. These changes didn't happen overnight. They reflected generations of wolves living in close proximity, tolerated and even nurtured by humans. Each generation represented trust that had held long enough to be passed down. For humans, too, the evidence lies in the stories painted on cave walls and the care given to wolf burials. You don't bury an animal with ceremony if you don't trust it. You don't waste precious food on a sick creature unless it has earned a place in your fragile circle of survival. These choices repeated across winters are the fingerprints of trust etched into history. By the time trust had taken root, the relationship was no longer just about scraps or warmth. It was about the recognition that both species were better together than apart. Trust me, humans could sleep more soundly knowing a wolf's ears and nose were sharper than their own. Trust me, wolves could linger near fire and shelter without fear of spears. And in that mutual recognition, something astonishing was born. The first partnership between humans and another predator. It was fragile, it was tentative, and it was constantly tested, but it endured. And in the next part, we'll step inside the shelters themselves to imagine how these sleeping arrangements may have looked. Wolves pressed against furs, humans curled beside them, firelight flickering on stone walls as two species learned to share the night. Step inside the shelter of an Ice Age clan on a winter night and you'd be struck first by the smell. Smoke from the fire clinging to hides, the musky odor of damp furs, the iron tang of meat. And if wolves were present, the unmistakable animal scent of wet fur and wildness. The glow of fire would paint the cave walls, or ripple along the framework of a bone hut, flickering shadows across faces huddled close together. People pressed shoulder to shoulder, curled around embers like moths drawn to fragile light. And then on the edges of that warmth, another shape low to the ground, ears alert, amber eyes reflecting firelight. A wolf not lunging, not growling, but settling down with a heavy exhale. Over time, those wolves edged closer. Not just scavengers outside the shelter anymore, but co-sleepers, bodies radiating heat. That humans, thin, skinned and vulnerable, desperately needed. Archaeological evidence doesn't give us a photograph of these moments, but it offers clues we can piece together. In some sites, wolf remains have been discovered within human habitation layers, suggesting they were not just passing visitors, but regular presences inside living spaces. Combined with evidence of burial rituals, it becomes plausible that wolves were not merely tolerated but welcomed, especially in the bitterest months. The mechanics of sleeping arrangements likely varied depending on the group. Some wolves may have lingered at the shelter's edge, curled in the threshold, as both guard and companion, while others, Particularly young or more docile ones slipped deeper inside to lie pressed against human bodies under shared furs. In doing so, they became part of the night's architecture of survival. Fire at the center, humans forming a ring around it, and wolves filling the gaps with their silent vigilance. The benefits of this arrangement were profound. Wolves carry thick double coats designed to withstand sub-zero temperatures. When pressed against humans, their fur trapped heat like an extra layer of insulation. Studies of thermo-armor regulation show that shared body warmth can significantly reduce energy expenditure in cold conditions. Energy that humans in the Ice Age could not afford to waste. Children and elders, the most vulnerable to frostbite and hypothermia, would have gained the most from a wolf curled at their side. In exchange, wolves received steady warmth from the fire, protection from rival predators, and a steady supply of scraps. It wasn't sentiment that drove this arrangement at first. It was necessity, biology, and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that makes or breaks survival. But as anyone who has shared warmth with another living being knows, necessity has a way of becoming intimacy. The sounds of the shelter at night must have been a symphony of survival. The crackle of embers, the slow breathing of sleeping humans, the soft rustle of furs, and the occasional huff or low growl from a dozing wolf. For humans, those growls were both a reassurance and a warning, the soundtrack of guardianship in the dark. If danger approached, a predator outside, footsteps in the snow, or even the faint scent of something unfamiliar, the wolves would stir first, their bodies tensing, ears pricking, heads lifting. That moment of alertness, often long before humans registered the threat, may have saved countless lives. The wolves were not just co-sleepers. They were alarm bells woven into the very rhythm of the night. Of course, this arrangement was not without risks. Wolves are not passive creatures, and trust could only stretch so far. A sudden movement, a whimper from a child, or the smell of fresh blood might trigger instincts that had not yet been softened by domestication. No doubt there were moments when things went wrong, when a wolf lashed out, or a human struck first out of fear. But over generations, through trial and error, the balance held more often than it broke. The wolves that tolerated closeness were the ones who stayed, survived, and bred. The humans who accepted their presence reaped the benefits of warmth and protection. Slowly, through thousands of nights spent sharing breath and space, the partnership evolved from uneasy coexistence to something approaching companionship. By imagining these sleeping arrangements, we glimpse the very roots of one of the most transformative relationships in human history. The picture of a caveman lying beside a wolf in a frozen cave is not just poetic. It's plausible, supported by evidence and logic. It tells us that survival was never only about tools or fire. It was also about the courage to share space, to reach across fear and difference, and to invite another predator into the most vulnerable part of human life, the place of sleep. In the next part, we'll dig deeper into the science of warmth sharing, exploring how body heat, breathing rhythms, and even the sound of a heartbeat played a role in making this bond not just practical, but profoundly human. The brilliance of this ancient arrangement becomes even clearer when you consider the science of warmth sharing. Humans, for all their cleverness, are not particularly well adapted to the cold. Our relatively hairless bodies lose heat quickly. Our fingers and toes are vulnerable to frostbite. And without fire or clothing, we are astonishingly fragile in icy climates. Wolves, by contrast, are built like machines for winter survival. Their double-layered coats, dense underfur for insulation, and coarse guard hairs for protection, trap heat so effectively that snow can settle on their backs without melting. When pressed against a wolf, a human body would have felt a surge of radiating warmth, a heat source that could mean the difference between life and death in a frozen cave. And unlike fire, which required constant attention, wolves were self-sustaining furnaces, their breath and bodies keeping the cold at bay through the long hours of the night. Modern studies on shared sleeping arrangements, from infants with parents to mountaineers huddling together for warmth, reveal fascinating details about how body heat circulates in close quarters. When two or more bodies lie pressed against each other, they form a microclimate, a pocket of shared warmth that drastically reduces heat loss to the surrounding air. This principle would have been amplified in Ice Age shelters where multiple humans draped in hides could add a wolf or two to the pile, effectively sealing in warmth. The temperature difference between a lone sleeper and one sharing space with another body can be as much as 10 degrees C, enough to turn a night of potential hypothermia into a night of survivable rest. For the young and the frail especially, that added warmth would have been invaluable. Beyond raw temperature, there's something subtler at play: the rhythm of breathing and heartbeats. Sleep studies today show that when humans and animals sleep in close proximity, their physiological rhythms often synchronize. Heart rates slow in tandem, breathing patterns align, and a strange kind of mutual calm emerges. For a human child curled against a wolf, the steady thump of its heart and the warmth of its breath could have been as soothing as a parent's embrace. For adults, too, the presence of another living body, predator or not, may have calmed the nervous system, lulling them into deeper, more restorative sleep. And in the Ice Age, where a clear mind and rested body meant sharper hunting, better judgment, and survival itself, the ability to truly rest was no small advantage. There is also the question of safety through proximity. Humans sleeping in isolation are far more vulnerable not just to the cold but to predators. In contrast, a cluster of bodies presents a barrier, a unified defense. Wolves, with their keen senses, added a critical layer of protection. Their acute hearing could detect the crunch of snow outside the shelter. Their noses could catch the scent of danger carried on the wind, and their growls could stir humans awake before a threat breached the camp. In this way, wolves were not only heaters, but sentinels, their very presence allowing humans to surrender more fully to sleep. Without them, slumber might have been fitful, haunted by the constant need to stay alert. With them, rest became safer, deeper, and more regular. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of this warmth sharing lies in what it did to the human mind. For early people, survival was not just about enduring the cold, but about managing fear, anxiety, and the crushing weight of exhaustion, sleeping beside wolves, feeling their fur against the skin, listening to their breathing in the dark may have rewired human psychology in subtle but lasting ways. Fear gave way to familiarity. What was once a source of terror became a source of comfort. In that shift, humans learned a profound lesson. The line between danger and ally is not fixed, but fluid, and survival sometimes demands a leap of faith into trust. That psychological leap is what laid the foundation for the domestication of wolves into dogs, for companionship as much as survival. So the act of sharing warmth was not merely practical, it was transformative. It changed nights from battles against frost into moments of connection. It gave children a chance to dream instead of shiver, gave adults the strength to face another day of hunting, and gave wolves a place in the human story. By lying side by side, heartbeats sinking in the firelight, humans and wolves forged a bond in the most intimate space of all, the place of sleep. And in the next part, we'll explore another crucial role these wolves play during those nights: the role of guardians and alarm systems, protecting humans from dangers that lurked just beyond the fire's fragile glow. Night was the most dangerous time for our ancestors. The fire might cast a circle of light, but beyond that circle was a world teeming with threats they could neither see nor predict. The darkness swallowed everything: the soft pad of hyenas circling, the slink of a cave lion moving low to the ground, the whisper of snow shifting in the wind. Humans are not built for the night. Our vision falters, our hearing dulls, and exhaustion pulls us toward unconsciousness, whether we like it or not. It was in this vulnerable span of hours that wolves proved their worth in ways fire and stone could not. Their ears twitched at the faintest crack of a branch. Their noses caught the scent of predators long before danger drew near, and their instincts drove them to react instantly. To share a shelter with wolves meant not just warmth, but vigilance, a living alarm system woven into the fabric of sleep. Anyone who has ever lived with a dog knows this instinct hasn't vanished. The faintest noise outside, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of wind against the door. And suddenly the animal is awake, ears up, alert. Now imagine that same sensitivity applied to the Ice Age, when a moment's warning could mean life or death. A wolf growl in the middle of the night would have snapped humans awake faster than any human guard. A low bark or sudden stir at the shelter's entrance could give them just enough time to ready their spears, to stoke the fire, to prepare for what might come. Wolves didn't need to be trained to do this. It was in their nature. Their survival instincts became human survival tools, and over countless winters that reliance grew into trust. It is important to remember that vigilance didn't just protect against predators. Other humans were just as dangerous. Clans competing for territory, food, or even access to a reliable cave might launch raids in the night, taking advantage of their rivals' exhaustion. In these cases, wolves again proved invaluable. Their senses could detect approaching footsteps or unfamiliar scents far earlier than any human guard. To attack a camp with wolves on its side was to risk alerting the entire group before the first blow could be struck. In this way, wolves became deterrents. Their presence alone enough to discourage would-be attackers. It wasn't loyalty in the modern sense, but it was effective. Wolves were unpredictable, dangerous, and loud when provoked. And that unpredictability was an asset to humans trying to hold on to fragile safety. The arrangement worked both ways. Wolves gained shelter from larger predators simply by staying close to humans. A lone wolf or small pack would have been vulnerable to cave lions or hyenas in open terrain. But tucked inside the sphere of human firelight, their risks diminished. Humans inadvertently shielded them, and in return, wolves offered their vigilance. The relationship was symbiotic in the most primal sense, both species lending strengths where the other was weak. Humans had fire tools and strategy. Wolves had senses tuned to the night and the kind of relentless alertness that no human could sustain. Together, they formed a system of protection far stronger than either could have managed alone. What makes this particularly extraordinary is how it transformed the nature of sleep itself. Without wolves, human rest would have been fragmented, interrupted by constant fears and the need for centuries. With wolves, slumber became deeper, steadier, and more restorative. Even if danger never came, the simple knowledge that someone or something was listening in the dark must have eased anxiety. This psychological comfort mattered just as much as practical defense in the harsh calculus of survival. The ability to sleep soundly without constant dread was a luxury that improved resilience, cognition, and health. In a way, wolves gifted humans not just safety, but rest, and through rest, strength. And so, in those frozen shelters where fire sputtered and the wind screamed outside, the wolves stood guard. They were not tamed, not yet pets, but they were protectors in their own way. Their growls were warnings, their presence a shield, their senses an extension of human vulnerability. By curling beside wolves, humans found not only warmth, but also guardianship, a silent pact that made the impossible nights survivable. In the next part, we'll move from the practical to the mysterious, exploring how myths and dreams may have woven wolves into the imagination of humans who shared their sleep, and how those dreams shaped the earliest spiritual bonds between the two species. To share sleep with wolves was not only a physical act of survival, but also a psychological and spiritual experience that must have left deep marks on the imagination of early humans. Night was not merely the absence of light. It was a realm of dreams, visions, and spirits. For people who lived without the boundaries of modern life, the dream world and the waking world were not sharply divided. If you fell asleep with wolves breathing beside you, their fur brushing against your skin, their low growls vibrating in your chest, it's impossible to imagine that those sensations didn't seep into dreams. Perhaps wolves entered the minds of humans, not only as companions in the physical sense, but as companions in the unseen realm. A wolf in a dream could be a guardian, a guide, or even an ancestor. Slowly, these nocturnal impressions may have crystallized into myths. Stories told in the firelight where the line between memory, imagination, and spirituality blurred. Cave paintings give us tantalizing clues about this. While we cannot know for certain why ancient people painted the animals they did, wolves and dog-like creatures appear alongside bison, mammoths, and horses. Some scholars argue that these depictions were not simply records of hunts, but symbolic reflections of relationships. To paint a wolf on a cave wall might have been a way of honoring its presence, of recognizing its role in human survival. When you consider that some wolves were buried with humans in ritual ways, the symbolic weight becomes even clearer. These were not casual associations. They were sacred. Wolves in dreams, wolves in paintings, wolves in graves. It all points toward a species that slipped beyond the role of animal and into the realm of myth. It's worth imagining what those myths might have sounded like. Around the fire, elders may have told children that the wolf was not merely a creature of the forest, but a spirit sent to protect their people through the harshest nights. Perhaps they said that the wolves who shared their sleep were messengers, keeping evil spirits at bay, or that the howl of wolves in the distance was not a threat, but a chorus of voices speaking to the moon, guiding hunters, warning families of danger. The line between practical reality and spiritual interpretation was always thin in prehistory. What we know as biology today was then understood as magic. A wolf keeping watch while humans slept might have been seen as proof that the spirits of the land favored them, that they had allies among the most feared predators of the ice. Dreams, too, must have been powerful conduits for this connection. Anyone who has dozed beside an animal knows how its warmth, sounds, and movements weave into the fabric of sleep. A wolf shifting in the night, its breath brushing your face, could appear in a dream as a protector walking by your side. A low growl half heard in slumber might transform into a warning in a vision, a call to pay attention to unseen dangers. Over generations, such experiences would accumulate into stories of wolf spirits guiding, guarding, or even adopting human children in their dreams. Later myths from cultures around the world, stories of wolf ancestors, wolf guardians, even entire clans claiming descent from wolves may well have roots in these earliest nights of shared slumber. This blending of survival and spirituality had another effect. It made the relationship between humans and wolves more resilient. Once a wolf was more than just a warm body. Once it was a protector spirit, a sacred ally. It became harder to see it as disposable. Killing a wolf without reason might bring bad luck. Caring for one might bring blessings. In this way, mythology acted as a glue that bound the practical partnership with emotional and spiritual reverence. What started as a biological arrangement, two species huddling together for warmth, was reinforced by stories, rituals, and beliefs that made the bond feel destined, inevitable, even holy. By the time myths had wrapped around the wolf, the relationship was no longer just about surviving winters. It was about identity, memory, and meaning. To sleep with wolves was not just to survive another night. It was to share in a pact that extended into the unseen. Wolves had become part of the human imagination, shaping the way people understood themselves, their world, and their place within it. And in the next part, we'll step out of the dream world and back into geography, exploring how different regions, from the frozen plains of Europe to the endless steppes of Siberia, shaped the ways humans and wolves shared their nights. The Ice Age was not a single uniform world of snow, but a patchwork of environments, each shaping the relationship between humans and wolves in subtle ways. In Europe, rolling plains stretched between forests and rivers dotted with caves that became natural shelters. In Siberia, endless steppes offered no such refuge, forcing people to build from what they had. Mammoth bones, wood hides. Across these regions, wolves were ever present, their howls carrying over frozen distances. But the way humans and wolves coexisted depended on the land itself. Geography was not just background. It was the stage upon which this fragile partnership played out. A clan in the forests of France would have lived differently with wolves than one braving the treeless tundra of Russia. Yet in both, necessity carved similar bonds. In Western and Central Europe, caves offered the closest thing to security. These shelters were defensible, warm compared to the outside, and often used repeatedly by generations of families. But caves were also magnets for danger. Lions, bears, and hyenas sought the same protection. For humans tucked inside, wolves circling near the entrance would have been both threat and shield. The echo of their growls in narrow stone passages could scare off predators looking to claim the space. Archaeological finds in French and Belgian caves reveal layers of human and animal use, sometimes overlapping. In such close quarters, the line between predator and partner blurred faster. Wolves at the cave mouth may have been tolerated as guardians as much as scavengers, their presence woven into the daily rhythm of shelter life. In the open expanses of Siberia, survival looked different. There were fewer caves, fewer natural defenses, and winter temperatures plunged to extremes. Even stone walls could not soften. Here, humans turned to mammoth bones, building domes and huts covered in hides, creating artificial caves on the tundra. Wolves on these open steppes were constant competitors, chasing the same herds of reindeer, mammoth calves, and bison that humans hunted. Yet precisely because resources were scarce, cooperation may have taken stronger root. To follow wolf tracks across the snow was to gain a guide to prey. To share warmth inside a bone hut was to create a buffer against winds that could peel skin from flesh. In Siberia's merciless openness, wolves were not just neighbors. They were companions against the void. Central Asia offered another variation. Here, grassy steppes stretched wide with seasonal shifts more extreme than in Europe. Summers were hot, winters brutal. For nomadic hunter-gatherers, movement was constant, following herds across vast distances. Wolves mirrored this lifestyle, roaming in packs that echoed human bands. Anthropologists argue that this parallelism, both species traveling, hunting, and settling in rhythm with the seasons, may have accelerated the trust between them. Wolves were not just familiar presences, but fellow travelers. Shadows on the horizon that became companions in the night when shelters were nothing more than temporary windbreaks of branches and hides. The warmth of wolves must have been even more vital, a living shield against the thin walls of nomadic life. Even within regions, variations in terrain shaped experience. Along rivers where fish provided food and travel was easier, wolves may have been less essential as hunting partners, but more valued as guardians of stored food. In mountainous areas, their ability to navigate slopes and detect danger before humans did would have been prized. Archaeological evidence shows that humans were astonishingly adaptable, shifting strategies depending on landscape. Wolves, too, adjusted, trailing humans wherever resources drew them. The bond was never identical everywhere, but it was resilient, finding form in caves, huts, steppes, and mountains alike. By tracing these regional threads, we see the universality of the wolf-human bond. Geography shaped the details, but the core remained the same. Cold nights, fragile shelters, and the desperate need for warmth and vigilance. Whether in the forests of Europe or the steppes of Siberia, humans and wolves found reasons to draw closer, to tolerate, and eventually to trust. The land demanded it, and both species answered. In the next part, we'll look more closely at the raw biology. How exactly wolves and humans shared warmth through body heat, and why this physical connection was so powerful in shaping the partnership. The simple act of lying down beside another living body may sound mundane to us, but in the brutal winters of the Ice Age, it was an act of extraordinary significance. Human beings are notoriously inefficient at retaining heat compared to many other mammals. With little natural insulation and a high surface area to volume ratio, we lose warmth quickly. The average naked human in freezing conditions can slip into hypothermia in less than an hour. Wolves, by contrast, are walking furnaces in such environments. Their thick, double-layered coats create an insulating barrier that traps warm air against their bodies, while their metabolism burns like a steady engine through the night. For a human to curl against a wolf was to borrow that engine, to plug into a system perfected by evolution for cold survival. Each night of shared warmth was not just comfort. It was a recalibration of biology itself, one species leaning on the physiology of another. Modern studies on heat conservation help us understand what Ice Age humans may have instinctively discovered. In groups, the thermal loss of individuals drops dramatically when bodies are pressed together. What's fascinating is how wolves amplify this effect. Their fur not only generates warmth, but also prevents heat loss through convection. When humans tucked themselves against wolves, especially under the heavy hides that served as blankets, they were effectively creating a sealed thermal unit. Air trapped between furs, bodies, and pelts would rise in temperature, creating a microclimate many degrees warmer than the surrounding cave air. This difference could mean life or death, particularly for children whose small bodies bled heat at terrifying rates. Archaeological studies of child burials show evidence of stunted growth and high winter mortality, underscoring just how critical every scrap of warmth must have been. Wolves unwittingly became heaters for the most vulnerable. The positioning of bodies also mattered. Wolves in packs often sleep in huddles, pressing close, wrapping tails over noses to conserve heat. Humans, especially in families, mirrored this instinct, curling together under furs. When the two species overlapped, their instincts aligned perfectly. Wolves at the periphery of human clusters formed a living shield, both warming and protecting the group. It is likely that pups and young wolves, less threatening and more docile, were the first to be welcomed close to children and elders, while larger adults remained near entrances or at the edges. This arrangement maximized warmth and safety simultaneously, blending human and wolf instincts into one shared architecture of survival. The effects of this warmth sharing extended beyond the immediate night. A warmer, more restful sleep meant humans woke stronger, sharper, and better prepared to hunt or gather. Sleep-deprived by cold, humans burn calories faster, lose dexterity, and make poor decisions, fatal flaws in the Ice Age environment. With wolves as co-sleepers, energy could be conserved. The wolves too benefited. Fires provided warmth that even their coats could not fully guarantee. And the shelter of humans gave protection against rivals. In this way, both species emerged from the night, not only alive, but better equipped for the brutal tasks of daylight survival. Each sunrise was a small victory, earned not by fire or tools alone, but by the beating hearts and warm bodies pressed together in the darkness. What's perhaps most fascinating is how these physical arrangements slowly carved grooves into human psychology. Warmth is inseparable from comfort in our minds. To feel heat radiating from another being is to feel safety, intimacy, belonging. By sleeping beside wolves, early humans may have unconsciously begun to associate them not with fear but with reassurance. Each night that ended without bloodshed reinforced this new connection, teaching humans that wolves could be trusted, even valued. Over time, this psychological shift became generational memory carried in stories, rituals, and instincts. The very same feelings of comfort that people now feel when a dog curls at their feet may trace their lineage back to these nights when wolves and humans kept each other alive in the frozen dark. So the science of warmth was not just biology. It was the scaffolding upon which one of the greatest transformations in human history was built. Wolves were heaters, sentinels, and eventually companions. Their role in thermorelation was not accidental. It was essential. The literal difference between frostbitten death and morning survival. And in the next part, we'll explore how this daytime cooperation, wolves hunting by instinct, humans by strategy, reinforced the trust built at night, creating a cycle of partnership that went far beyond the firelight. When dawn broke over the Ice Age landscape, survival didn't pause just because the night had been endured. If anything, the challenges grew sharper with daylight. Food was never guaranteed, and the difference between a successful hunt and an empty return could determine whether a family lived or starved. Here again, wolves became more than companions of the night. They became mirrors of human effort during the day. Wolves are among nature's most efficient hunters, not because of raw power, but because of cooperation. They track prey over long distances, wear it down with relentless endurance, and strike in coordinated packs. Humans, though equipped with tools and fire, shared the same principle. They thrived by working together, by using strategy, patience, and communication. In this shared rhythm of cooperation, humans saw themselves reflected in wolves, and wolves perhaps recognized something familiar in humans. The connection between daytime hunts and nighttime bonds is more than symbolic. Archaeological evidence from Ice Age sites suggests that humans may have intentionally followed wolves to find prey, just as wolves shadowed humans in hope of scraps. Some of the earliest proto-remains show stomach contents with traces of human food, evidence of meals shared after the hunt. This overlap wasn't simply opportunistic. It reinforced a pattern. Wolves that tolerated humans by day were tolerated at night. And the reverse was true as well. Every successful hunt together, whether by intention or accident, built a ledger of trust. Humans gained sharper eyes and ears on the trail. Wolves gained access to meat and marrow they might not otherwise claim. Each day of cooperation bled seamlessly into each night of shared warmth, creating a cycle where trust was constantly renewed. It is easy to imagine a hunt on the frozen plains. A herd of reindeer spooked into movement. Wolves weaving through the snow at their flanks while humans, spears in hand, cut across their path. The wolves chased, driving the herd into confusion. The humans anticipated, moving with calculated strikes. When an animal finally fell, both species gained. Humans feasted on the choicest cuts, preserving fat and hides for later. Wolves devoured scraps, sinew, and bones, cleaning what humans discarded. No part of the animal went to waste, and no part of the effort felt one-sided. By nightfall, when both groups returned exhausted to their shelters, the satisfaction of the hunt lingered. Wolves settled in close, bellies full, bodies warm, and humans allowed them to rest nearer. The day's cooperation spilled into the night's companionship. Over generations, this rhythm likely shaped which wolves thrived. Those willing to run near humans, to restrain their aggression, to linger after hunts were rewarded with food and warmth. Those that remained hostile faded into the wild, leaving behind lineages more compatible with human life. This natural selection, subtle and unconscious, carved the path toward domestication. It wasn't a planned breeding program, but the steady reinforcement of traits that made life easier for both sides. Each hunt that ended with wolves resting in human shelters. Each night that ended with humans sleeping more deeply because wolves were near pushed the partnership forward another step. The psychological impact of hunting together cannot be overstated. For humans, seeing wolves work as packs must have been a lesson in cooperation, hierarchy, and persistence. For wolves, seeing humans wield fire and tools may have etched them into the wolf's perception as powerful allies, leaders of a larger mixed-species pack. This mutual recognition elevated their relationship beyond mere survival. They weren't just tolerating each other anymore. They were learning from each other, shaping behavior, adapting instincts. At night, when the hunts were over, those lessons lingered in the glow of the fire as wolves and humans alike drifted into dreams of prey, danger, and companionship. Thus, the cycle of day and night with them closer together. By day, wolves and humans hunted side by side or in mirrored patterns, building trust through necessity and shared success. By night, they lay side by side, building intimacy through warmth and vigilance. The bond was no longer just about enduring cold. It was about reshaping survival itself into a cooperative dance between two predators that discovered they were stronger together. And in the next part, we'll look at how fire, fur, and fang, the tools and instincts of humans and wolves, balanced one another in the delicate choreography of survival. Survival during the Ice Age was never about a single strength. Fire alone could not hunt. Furs alone could not defend, and raw instinct could not always overcome the cunning of predators. It was a combination of assets that tipped the scales, and in this strange alliance between humans and wolves, the balance was nothing short of revolutionary. Humans brought fire, a force that had terrified animals for millennia, reshaping the landscape, illuminating the night, and warding off predators that would otherwise encroach. Wolves brought fang, the raw biological machinery of predation, honed by evolution to tear through flesh and defend against threats. And then there was fur, the natural armor and insulation that wolves carried effortlessly, which humans tried to mimic through clothing but never fully equaled. Together, fire, fur, and fang created a triangle of survival, each piece reinforcing the other in the endless battle against cold and danger. Consider fire first. Archaeological evidence shows that humans of the Upper Paleolithic period were masters of controlling flame, building hearths and caves, and even transporting embers from site to site. Fire was warmth, light, and weapon. But fire demanded constant attention. Fuel had to be collected, flames had to be guarded against the wind, and sparks could consume scarce shelters in minutes. Fire was power, but it was fragile. Wolves, in contrast, were not fire makers, but their presence extended the influence of fire. Their growls and howls at the edge of camp amplified the deterrent effect of the flames. Where fire pushed predators back with light, wolves pushed them back with threat. The two together made a perimeter that neither could achieve alone. A human fire with no guards might attract scavengers. Wolves without fire risked exposure and attack, but combined the camp became something formidable, a fortress in the dark. Then there was fur, the currency of warmth in a frozen world. Humans relied on the hides of animals, stitched into garments or draped as blankets to shield themselves against the cold. Yet no amount of crude tailoring equaled the living insulation of a wolf's coat. Wolves carried their warmth with them, breathing heat into the spaces they occupied. For humans, pressed close under shared hides. The addition of a wolf body was like adding another layer of clothing, another blanket against the cold. The fire warmed the air, but the wolves warmed the flesh. The synergy between artificial and natural insulation gave humans a margin of safety that fur alone could not provide. In turn, humans extended the reach of wolf fur by building shelters where wind could not strip away warmth, offering a stability wolves rarely found in the open wild. And then there were fangs, the ultimate weapons of survival. Humans had spears tipped with flint, knives made of bone, and eventually bows and arrows. But these tools required skill, preparation, and coordination. Wolves carried their weapons in their mouths, ready at a moment's notice, efficient and brutal. When a threat emerged suddenly at night, wolves could respond faster than any human, buying the seconds needed for people to gather their weapons. During hunts, wolf jaws tore through flesh that human tools could not easily process, breaking bones, stripping sinew, and making even the scraps usable. Fangs did not replace spears, nor did spears replace fangs. Together they brought in the arsenal of survival. A pack of wolves at the edge of camp meant more than companionship. It meant the presence of teeth, sharper and faster than stone. This triad, fire, fur, and fang, also carried symbolic weight to the human imagination. Fire was a gift of the gods or spirits, something magical and alive. Wolves, with their coats and their ferocity embodied qualities humans admired but lacked. Resilience against the cold, fearlessness in the hunt. By sharing space with wolves, humans weren't just surviving. They were aligning themselves with forces larger than themselves. The fire burned, the furs draped, the wolves breathed, all woven into a nightly ritual of protection. It is no wonder that wolves later became figures of myth and legend, embodying strength, loyalty, and danger all at once. By the time this balance was established, it was clear that humans and wolves were no longer accidental neighbors. They were participants in a shared system of survival, each compensating for the weaknesses of the other. Fire extended human dominance over nature. Wolves extended human vigilance and strength. Fur extended the endurance of both. In this fusion, the impossible became survivable. And in the next part, we'll look at how these bonds were honored, not just in practice, but in ritual and art, as wolves began to appear in the symbolic lives of humans, painted on cave walls, buried with reverence, and woven into the earliest stories of meaning. The moment wolves crossed from mere survival allies into the symbolic world of ritual, something extraordinary happened. They were no longer just bodies pressed close in the cold or watchful eyes at the edge of campfires. They became part of the human imagination, creatures with meaning beyond tooth and fur. Archaeological sites across Europe and Asia reveal clues to this transition, and they are not subtle. Wolves were buried with care, their skulls arranged deliberately, sometimes alongside humans, sometimes set apart in what appear to be ceremonial deposits. These burials speak louder than any words could. Wolves were not simply tolerated, they were honored. To bury an animal is to recognize its significance, to admit that its life and death touched the community in ways too profound to ignore. Take Pranosti in the Czech Republic, a site dating back roughly 27,000 years. There, the remains of dozens of canids were discovered, some resembling wolves, others closer to what we might call protodogs. Many skulls bore signs of intentional placement, arranged, decorated, even pierced as if worn as ornaments. In one striking case, a wolf skull was found with a mammoth bone set between its jaws, a deliberate act that suggests ritual symbolism. This was not butchery, it was reverence. To those Ice Age people, the wolf was clearly more than a source of warmth or scraps. It had crossed into the realm of the sacred, its power acknowledged in acts of ritual that tied the living to the dead. Other sites tell similar stories. At Bonn Oberkassel in Germany, the remains of a wolf-dog hybrid were found buried with a man and woman dating to around 14,000 years ago. This animal showed signs of serious illness during life. Yet, it had survived long enough to heal partially, a survival only possible with human care. When death finally came, it was not discarded like refuse, but buried with the people it had lived beside. This intertwining of fates is powerful. Humans and wolves united not only in life but in death. The graves suggest that the bond had become kinship. The wolf, as much a member of the group as any human, mourned and honored as such. Beyond burials, wolves appear in art. Cave paintings in France, Spain, and beyond depict not only the great prey animals of the hunt, bison, horses, mammoths, but also wolves and dog-like figures. These images may not be as common as other animals, but their presence is striking. Scholars debate whether these were records of hunts, spiritual totems, or storytelling devices, but their inclusion alone speaks volumes. To commit an image to stone was an act of importance, a way of preserving meaning for generations. Wolves, it seems, had earned their place among the creatures immortalized in ochre and charcoal. They were not only part of the physical landscape, but the mental and spiritual one as well. Ritual significance likely extended into oral traditions, though no words from that time survive. Still, by looking at later myths, we can glimpse echoes of those Ice Age beliefs. Across cultures, wolves appear as guardians, teachers, ancestors, and even creators. From the legend of Romulus and Reis in Rome to Siberian tales of wolf ancestors guiding clans, the pattern is clear. Humans came to see wolves as more than animals. These stories may well have their roots in those earliest winters when wolves curled beside human children, their breath mingling in the darkness, their presence becoming inseparable from the idea of protection. Myth grew from memory, memory from experience, and experience from survival. By the time wolves entered the world of ritual, they had become inseparable from the human story. They were no longer just predators or allies of convenience, but beings bound to people in ways spiritual as well as practical. The act of painting their forms on walls, of burying them with care, of shaping stories around their howls, transformed wolves into symbols of endurance, guardianship, and kinship. And in the next part, we'll shift the focus to the most vulnerable members of the human group, children and elders, and explore what sleeping beside wolves meant for them, and how these intergenerational bonds deepened the partnership even further. In every human group of the Ice Age, survival hinged not only on the hunters and gatherers, but on the quiet persistence of children and elders. These were the most fragile lives in the clan, the ones most threatened by the brutal cold of winter nights. Infants could not regulate their body temperature as effectively as adults, and their small size made them lose heat at a terrifying rate. Elders, meanwhile, often weakened by years of hardship, struggled against the cold as much as they did against dwindling strength. For them, the arrival of wolves into the warmth of human shelters was not merely an interesting development. It was a lifeline. The soft fur and steady heat of wolves pressed close against these vulnerable bodies may have been the difference between life and death. If you want to understand how deeply humans came to value wolves, you need only imagine a child surviving the night because a wolf's body kept the frost at bay. Parents must have noticed this quickly. A wolf pup or a smaller adult nestled beside a child gave off more warmth than any hide could provide alone. The sound of breathing, the steady thump of a heart, even the soft rise and fall of the wolf's chest, all of it created reassurance in a world otherwise dominated by fear. In turn, children who grew up with wolves beside them would have learned from the very beginning that these animals were not only safe, but comforting. To them, a wolf was not a predator outside the cave, but a familiar presence within it, as much a part of their childhood as their parents or siblings. That shift in perception, beginning in the cradle, so to speak, laid the foundation for generational trust. Children raised with wolves did not see them as enemies. They saw them as companions of warmth and safety. For elders, the bond carried a different weight. These were the storytellers, the keepers of memory, the ones who connected the present to the past. They had endured more winters than anyone else, and they understood intimately how thin the line between life and death could be. A wolf curling against an eeler's side was more than warmth. It was respect for the fragility of age, a reassurance that even the weakest members of the group were not abandoned. Elders may have been the first to interpret the wolf's presence in symbolic terms, weaving it into stories told by the fire. After all, they were the voices that carried meaning from one generation to the next when they described wolves as protectors or as spirits of endurance. Children listened and the seeds of mythology were planted. It's also worth noting how wolves themselves fit into this intergenerational equation. Wolf packs, like human clans, are structured around care for the young and respect for experience. Pups are nurtured by the entire pack. Not only their parents, and older wolves often guide hunts or guard dens, even when they are too old to lead the chase. This parallel social structure may have resonated with humans on a subconscious level. They recognized in wolves the same cycle of vulnerability and care that defined their own families. A wolf tolerating the playful tug of a child's hand on its fur was not so different from an elder smiling at the antics of a grandchild. These mirrored patterns of care and patience reinforced the sense that wolves were not alien creatures, but reflections of the human family itself. The safety wolves provided to children and elders extended beyond warmth. Their vigilance at night meant that the most defenseless sleepers were shielded from predators and intruders. For parents, this must have been a relief, a chance to sleep without the constant dread that danger might snatch their child in the dark. For elders who often slept lightly, the low growl of a nearby wolf might have been both a warning and a comfort, a reminder that even as their own bodies weakened, another creature stood guard. The psychological effect of that protection cannot be overstated. To live without constant fear is to live with strength, and in the Ice Age, strength was survival. Through the eyes of children and elders, the wolf-human bond became something more than a practical arrangement. It became generational. Children grew up trusting wolves. Elders sanctified their presence through story and ritual, and both groups benefited most directly from their warmth and protection. In this way, wolves became woven into the deepest layers of human identity, into memory, myth, and daily life. And in the next part, we'll explore how wolves also taught humans something profound. Lessons of pack structure, loyalty, and hierarchy that would shape the way early societies understood themselves. When we look at wolves today, their pack structure feels so natural and familiar that it's easy to forget how extraordinary it must have seemed to Ice Age humans. Wolves organized themselves around a clear hierarchy, dominant leaders at the center, hunters and defenders supporting them, pups cared for communally, and elders holding wisdom that still served the group even if their physical strength had waned. To early humans, small bands of hunter-gatherers struggling to survive in a hostile world. This mirrored their own needs so perfectly that it was impossible not to notice. Humans saw in wolves a reflection of themselves, and in that reflection they found both validation and instruction. The wolf pack became a living lesson in how to survive, not just as individuals, but as a cooperative unit. The parallels ran deep. In both species, survival depended on cohesion. A human clan fractured by rivalry or mistrust was as doomed as a wolf pack whose members abandoned one another. Loyalty wasn't just an ideal, it was a necessity. By sleeping beside wolves, watching their behavior day and night, humans would have seen this loyalty expressed in countless small gestures. Wolves sharing food with pups, protecting each other in fights, or mourning lost members with quiet howls. These were not abstractions. They were daily realities. To see loyalty embodied in another species may have reinforced the value of loyalty within their own clans. Around the fire, parents could point to the wolves outside and say, in effect, see how they survive. We must do the same. Hierarchy was another lesson carved into the nights of shared survival. Wolves lived by order, with leaders who made decisions for the group, enforcing discipline, but also shouldering responsibility. Humans, too, had leaders, elders, skilled hunters, or those with wisdom in navigating the land. Yet leadership was fragile, always at risk of challenge. Watching wolves, humans may have seen the necessity of balance. Leaders who were too harsh drove their packs into chaos, while leaders who protected and guided inspired loyalty. Archaeologists studying burial sites often note evidence of status, ornaments, tools, or carefully chosen grave goods that suggest structured hierarchy among humans. It's not unreasonable to think that some of these patterns were observed, reinforced, or even inspired by the social order of wolves. But wolves didn't just model leadership and loyalty. They modeled cooperation. Their hunts required coordination, so finely tuned that failure by one member could doom the entire chase. Humans already knew cooperation was vital, but wolves demonstrated it with relentless clarity. Perhaps in watching wolves flank prey, tire it out, and strike at the perfect moment, humans were reminded of the strength of strategy over brute force. It's even possible that early hunting strategies were refined by mimicking wolves surrounding a herd, driving it into an ambush, or working in roles that maximized success. What began as observation may have become imitation, and imitation became innovation. The wolves were teachers whether they knew it or not. Sleeping with wolves at night only deepened these impressions. Inside the shelter where humans and wolves lay together, The lessons of the day blended into the intimacy of the night. A child might fall asleep with a wolf curled beside them, then dream of running with the pack, internalizing the rhythms of loyalty and cooperation before they were even old enough to hunt. An elder warming their frail body against a wolf's flank might tell stories about the importance of unity, drawing on what they had seen in wolf behavior. Through countless winters, these moments turned into culture, into norms, into shared values. Wolves were not only guardians of the body, they became guardians of the mind, shaping the way humans thought about family, duty, and community. By the time this cultural exchange had taken root, wolves were no longer just outsiders, tolerated for their warmth or vigilance. They were woven into the very social fabric of early human life. They taught by example the lessons that no lecture could deliver. That survival comes from loyalty, that strength lies in unity, that hierarchy is meaningless without responsibility. And in the next part, we'll turn to stories of protection, real or remembered, of nights when wolves defended human camps from predators or rivals. Moments that cemented their role, not just as companions, but as protectors in the truest sense. Protection was one of the most profound gifts wolves offered to early humans, and it likely cemented their place not only in shelters, but in human memory. Imagine the scene. A cave lit by a dwindling fire, a family huddled under hides, the long night pressing in with its endless cold. Outside, a cave lion stalks the entrance, its paws silent on the snow, muscles coiled for attack. Inside, no human stirs. They are exhausted, drifting between shivers and shallow dreams. But the wolves stir. One growls low, a sound that vibrates through the stone floor. Another rises, hackles raised, teeth bared, their bodies forming a barrier at the threshold. The lion pauses, measuring the risk. A camp with only humans would have been easy prey. But a camp guarded by wolves is no simple target. The predator turns back into the darkness, and the humans inside never even know how close death had crept. It's easy to dismiss such stories as imagination, but archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggest otherwise. In many traditional societies where semi-domesticated dogs still guard villages, attacks by predators are significantly reduced. Wolves with their territorial instincts would have been even more formidable. Their presence, their scent, their sound, these alone could discourage rival predators from venturing near. And when warning wasn't enough, wolves had the tools to fight. Their fangs, speed, and pack coordination made them dangerous even to larger animals. For humans, this was a priceless advantage. They didn't have to fight every battle themselves. The wolves absorbed the first strike of danger, buying time, reducing risk, and ensuring that the weakest, children, elders, the sleeping, were protected. Protection wasn't limited to animals. Other humans posed threats just as deadly, and wolves may have played a role here as well. Rival clans searching for food or shelter could attack in the night, hoping to catch a camp off guard. But a line of wolves at the entrance was a formidable deterrent. Even if wolves weren't loyal soldiers in the human sense, their unpredictability made them dangerous to approach. Would they attack outright? Would they howl, alerting the camp? Would they retreat into the shadows only to circle back in ambush? The very uncertainty was enough to make would-be intruders think twice. In the harsh economy of the Ice Age, where risk could not be wasted, even the possibility of wolf resistance could save human lives. The psychological comfort of this protection was as valuable as the physical defense. Humans are vulnerable in sleep, our senses dulled, our bodies relaxed, our defenses lowered. To drift off in a world where predators roamed freely was to gamble every night. But with wolves at the threshold, the gamble changed. Parents slept easier, knowing wolves would stir before danger reached their children. Hunters rested deeper, storing energy for the next day's chase. Elders closed their eyes with less fear, even when no predator approached. The presence of wolves created a buffer of safety that allowed humans to live, not merely endure. This was more than protection. It was peace of mind, the ability to dream without constant dread. Over time, these protective acts likely transformed into stories. Perhaps around the fire, an elder told of the night a wolf stood between the clan and a bear, buying them enough time to escape. Or of the time a rival group fled at the sound of wolves snarling at the cave entrance. Whether embroidered in the telling or true to memory, these tales gave wolves an exalted place in human imagination. They were not only heaters and hunters, they were guardians, sentinels of the night, who risked themselves for the fragile lives of their companions. And with each story retold, trust deepened and the bond tightened. Wolves had proved themselves not only useful, but indispensable. By the time this protective role had taken root, wolves were no longer just tolerated. They were valued as shields against the dark. They were the eyes that never closed, the ears that never slept, the fangs that kept death at bay. For humans, this was nothing short of miraculous. An animal once feared as a predator had become a defender. And in the next part, we'll trace this transformation in the bones themselves. Looking at the genetic clues of domestication, how the wolves who guarded the nights slowly changed into creatures we would one day recognize as dogs. The story of humans and wolves is written not only in bones and burials, but deep within DNA itself. Every modern dog, from the tiniest Chihuahua to the largest Mastiff, carries within it the genetic legacy of wolves that once slept beside our ancestors in the freezing dark. Scientists studying ancient remains have traced this transformation back tens of thousands of years, revealing that domestication wasn't a sudden invention, but a slow, winding process of evolution. Wolves that lingered near human camps, tolerated their presence, and scavenged from their kills passed on different genes than those that stayed wild and wary. Over time, these small differences accumulated, shaping a lineage of animals that were less aggressive, more sociable, and better suited to life alongside humans. In effect, humans didn't just adopt wolves, wolves adopted humans, changing themselves through natural selection into something new. Protodogs. Genetic studies suggest that this divergence began at least 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Mitochondrial DNA extracted from ancient canid remains shows lineages distinct from wild wolves, indicating that some populations had already begun to evolve in response to human proximity. These protodogs were not yet the floppy-eared companions we know today, but their temperaments were shifting. They were more tolerant of humans, less fearful, and more inclined to approach. This wasn't the result of deliberate breeding programs. Prehistoric humans weren't carefully choosing which wolves to mate. Instead, it was natural selection at work. Wolves that were aggressive or unpredictable were killed or driven away. Those that were calmer survived, found food, and reproduced. Over thousands of generations, the wolves most compatible with humans flourished and their genes spread. What's fascinating is how these genetic changes express themselves physically. Skulls from proto-dogs often show shorter snouts, smaller teeth, and broader jaws compared to wild wolves. These differences may seem minor, but they reflect a shift toward animals that were less specialized for tearing through bone and more suited for life alongside humans. Their brains also appear slightly smaller than those of wild wolves, particularly in regions associated with stress and aggression, suggesting that they were becoming more manageable, less reactive. Even their coats may have begun to vary, with different colors appearing as byproducts of domestication. These changes weren't deliberate traits selected by humans. They were side effects of survival in a human world. The wolves that could live near us without fear or violence were the ones who carried these traits forward. DNA also tells us something profound about migration. As humans spread across continents, protodogs spread with them. Remains of domesticated canids appear in Europe, Siberia, and even early sites in the Near East, often in close association with human settlements. This indicates that once the bond had formed, humans were unwilling to leave their canine companions behind. A wolf dog wasn't just a scavenger, it was a partner worth carrying into new lands. This suggests a shift in perception. Wolves were no longer tolerated out of necessity. They were valued enough to become part of the journey. When families packed up their hides, tools, and food to move on, they also brought the animals that had warmed their children through countless nights. The genetic story also raises an intriguing possibility. Wolves may have domesticated themselves. Biologists call this self-domestication, where animals adapt to human presence without being intentionally bred. Much like how foxes in modern experiments become tame after only a few generations of selecting for calm behavior, wolves hovering around camps may have evolved simply by being near us. The calmer they were, the closer they came, the more food and safety they gained, the more they survived, the more their genes spread. In this sense, wolves weren't forced into domestication. They chose it generation after generation, until the line between wolf and dog blurred into something entirely new. By the time these genetic changes were well underway, wolves had already shifted from outsiders to insiders, from scavengers to companions. Their DNA carried the marks of human influence, and human culture carried the marks of their presence. Together, the two species rewrote not just their own destinies, but the destiny of the planet. And in the next part, we'll explore how this bond was immortalized in burial practices. Humans and protodogs laid to rest side by side, proof that the relationship was no longer just practical, but profoundly emotional. The clearest sign that wolves had crossed into the human family is found not in their paw prints in the snow, but in their resting places beneath the earth. For most of prehistory, animals were butchered, consumed, and discarded without ceremony. Bones littered campsites, scattered among hearths, refused pits and hunting grounds. Yet at certain sites, wolf and protodog remains were not discarded like scraps, but carefully placed in burials, often alongside humans. These moments stand out like beacons in the archaeological record. Evidence that the relationship had transcended utility. A creature that once haunted the firelight had become a companion, a protector, perhaps even a spiritual kin. One of the most striking examples comes from Bonn Oberkassel in Germany, dating to roughly 14,000 years ago. Their archaeologists uncovered a double human burial, a man and a woman, along with the remains of a young canid. The animal had suffered from a severe illness during its life, an infection that would have made it unable to feed itself. Yet it survived for weeks, perhaps months before death. The only explanation is that humans cared for it, feeding and protecting it despite its weakness. And when it died, they buried it with themselves as though it belonged not to the wild, but to the family. This is not an act of convenience. It is an act of love, of grief, of recognition that the bond between species was more than practical. Other sites tell similar stories. At Predosti in the Czech Republic, dating back about 27,000 years, dozens of canned remains were uncovered, many showing evidence of deliberate placement. Some skulls bore holes that may have been used to string them as ornaments, while others were arranged in ways that suggest ritual purpose. These animals were not casually discarded. They were given meaning in death. In Siberia, too, protodog burials have been found, some accompanied by grave goods such as tools or beads, as though the animals were honored in the same way as human members of the clan. Each of these burials speaks to the same truth. Wolves and dogs had become part of the symbolic and emotional core of human life. Why bury an animal? The answer lies in the role they played in life. Wolves weren't just heaters or hunters. They were guardians, companions, even surrogate family. A wolf that had slept beside a child through countless winters, growled at predators in the night, and joined in the hunt by day was not easily forgotten. When death came, humans treated that animal not as a carcass, but as a soul worthy of ritual. The act of burial symbolized inclusion, an acknowledgement that wolves had crossed the boundary from wild to kin. In laying them to rest, humans declared that their bond was not just of the moment, but eternal, woven into memory and meaning. These burials also hint at a deeper spiritual connection. In many cultures, burial practices reflect beliefs about the afterlife. To bury a wolf or proto-dog with humans may have expressed the hope that the bond would continue beyond death. that the animal would guard, guide, or accompany its human companions into whatever world awaited beyond. The symbolism resonates with later myths, from the Norse belief in wolves accompanying gods to Native American traditions where wolves serve as guides and teachers. Perhaps these myths were seeded in the soil of such burials planted when ancient people first decided that wolves were not simply beasts, but partners in both life and death. By the time wolves were laid to rest in human graves, the partnership had become inseparable. These were no longer wild animals tolerated for warmth or protection. They were companions, mourned, honored, and remembered. The burials are silent, but their message echoes across millennia. Wolves had become part of us. And in the next part, we'll explore how this bond extended into human culture at night, shaping the very stories told by the fire. The legends and traditions born in the presence of wolves, their howls woven into the first lullabies of humankind. When the hunts were over and the night settled heavy over the land, Ice Age people turned to the only tool that could warm the mind as much as the fire warmed the body: storytelling. These gatherings around the hearth were not just entertainment. They were survival in their own right, binding the group together, teaching lessons and preserving knowledge across generations. And in those stories, wolves inevitably appeared. How could they not? They were there lying at the mouth of the shelter, their silhouettes outlined by the firelight, their howls rising in the distance. Wolves weren't abstract creatures to these people. They were present, immediate, and mysterious. Their roles in the tales told to children, in the songs hummed by elders, would have been shaped by the very real companionship of fur against skin and breath mingling in the dark. One can imagine the earliest wolf stories beginning not with grandeur but with observation. A hunter might recount how a wolf helped chase reindeer into a ravine, or how their growls warned of a prowling lion. Such accounts, retold and slightly embellished, would evolve into stories of wolves as protectors, guides, or even supernatural beings around the fire. These stories became both memory and myth, lessons and entertainment. They reminded listeners that wolves weren't simply animals. They were collaborators in survival, beings with wills and intentions that demanded respect. In this way, storytelling transformed daily experiences into cultural memory, ensuring that the bond was passed not only through practice, but through imagination. For children, these tales were formative. A child who grew up with wolves pressed against their side at night and stories of wolf guardians in their ears would never see the creatures as mere threats. Instead, wolves became woven into their sense of security, their identity, even their dreams. A bedtime story about a wolf spirit guiding hunters safely home would blur seamlessly with the real wolf curled at their feet, creating a world where myth and reality were inseparable. Through stories, trust became tradition, and tradition became culture. This was how wolves moved from flesh to symbol, from practical ally to sacred figure. The role of wolves in early storytelling likely extended to ritual performance. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ice Age people engaged in dances, chants, and symbolic acts around firelight, sometimes imitating the movements of animals. Wolves, with their haunting howls and coordinated pack hunts, must have inspired mimicry. Perhaps young hunters learned courage by imitating wolf growls, or shamans wore wolf pelts to channel their perceived spiritual power. Storytelling wasn't just words. It was embodied in sound, movement, and ritual. Wolves were not only in the stories. They were part of the performance of memory, shaping the rhythms of culture as deeply as the rhythms of survival. Even the soundscape of the night became part of these stories. The howl of wolves echoing through valleys could be terrifying or reassuring, depending on the tale one had been told. To some, it was a warning of spirits. To others, it was the voice of guardians keeping watch. This ambiguity gave wolves a unique place in the human imagination. They were both danger and salvation, both predator and protector. Storytelling gave shape to this duality, teaching children to respect the creatures without fearing them blindly. The wolf became a symbol of balance, a reminder that survival came not from domination alone, but from coexistence with forces greater than oneself. By the time these traditions had taken root, wolves were no longer only physical presences in human life. They were cultural presences, etched into the stories, songs, and rituals that carried meaning across generations. Sleeping with wolves had given humans more than warmth. It had given them new stories, new myths, new ways of seeing the world. And in the next part, we'll explore how these early cultural bonds echoed into the future, shaping the domestication process further as wolves shifted from sacred figures in myth to practical partners in daily life. As much as wolves entered the spiritual lives of humans through story and ritual, their bond was never purely symbolic. Every winter brought harsh reminders that survival hinged on daily practical cooperation. If wolves were protectors in myth, they were also hunters in reality. If they were guardians of dreams, they were also guardians of camps. The movement between the sacred and the practical was constant, and this balance ensured that the relationship endured. Early people didn't divide their lives neatly into categories of religion, survival, and companionship. To them, warmth, protection, and reverence were all woven together. A wolf could be both a creature of spirit and a provider of scraps, both a mythical guardian and a breathing, snoring body curled up at the fire's edge. This seamless integration made wolves indispensable, not only as symbols, but as daily partners in the business of staying alive. Daylight hours made this practicality most apparent. Humans had always been skilled hunters, but their strategies were enhanced by the presence of wolves. Some wolves followed human hunting parties at a distance, scavenging what was left behind. Others, more daring, closed the gap, learning to run alongside hunters, to flush prey from cover, or to track wounded animals over snow. Archaeological evidence hints at this overlap. Bones of prey animals at human sites bear gnaw marks that could only have come from canids feeding after humans had taken their share. Over time, this became routine. Wolves received food not as chance windfall, but as expected share. And with food came familiarity. And with familiarity came closeness. The same wolves that ran beside hunters in the day lay beside their children at night, tying daily survival to nightly comfort. The symbiosis was gradual, but it had momentum. Wolves that proved helpful or at least harmless during hunts were given tolerance, scraps, and eventually access to shelter. Those that became too aggressive were killed or driven away. This selective pressure created a filter, ensuring that each new generation of wolves lingering near humans was slightly more compatible than the last. Humans were not yet deliberately breeding wolves, but their actions shaped wolf evolution all the same. The practical decisions of hunters who to tolerate, who to reject, echoed across centuries, bending the trajectory of an entire species. Every successful winter reinforced this process. By the time a wolf curled into the crook of a child's arm or stood guard at the mouth of a shelter, generations of quiet choices had made it possible. The line between ritual and practicality blurred most clearly in acts of care. To nurse a sick wolf back to health, to feed it when it could not feed itself, may have been inspired by spiritual respect, but the outcome was practical. A recovered wolf returned to guard and hunt again. Likewise, to bury a wolf with honor may have been an act of reverence, but it also reinforced the bond among the living, ensuring that humans continued to trust wolves as daily allies. These actions show that early people understood the reciprocity of the bond. Wolves gave protection and warmth, and humans gave care and food. It was not one-sided. It was an exchange, both pragmatic and emotional. As domestication crept forward, wolves began to adapt visibly to this dual role. Skulls shifted toward shapes more like proto-dogs. Temperaments softened, and behavior tilted toward cooperation. Yet to humans of the time, these changes weren't seen as evolution. They were seen as proof of trust fulfilled. Each generation of wolves seemed easier to live with, more willing to follow humans, more comfortable in their shelters. This gradual taming was not a project, but a partnership born of countless shared nights and hunts. The wolf's role in human life was no longer occasional. It was daily, essential, constant. By the time this stage of the bond had been reached, the distinction between myth and reality had ceased to matter. Wolves were protectors in the dark, helpers in the hunt, companions in ritual, and friends in sleep. They were part of the human family in every sense that mattered. And in the next part, we'll explore the risks of this arrangement, the diseases, injuries, and dangers that came with living so closely with wolves, and how humans managed those risks while still choosing to keep them near. No partnership in the Ice Age was without its risks, and the bond with wolves was no exception. To sleep beside a creature with fangs sharp enough to crush bone and instincts honed for predation was always a gamble. Trust, no matter how carefully nurtured, could be shattered in an instant by hunger, fear, or misunderstanding. Early humans must have known this intimately. They had seen wolves tear apart prey, watched them snarl over scraps, heard their howls split the night with both beauty and menace. Inviting such animals into the intimate space of sleep was not a decision made lightly, yet the very fact that it happened and endured tells us that the benefits outweighed the dangers, even when blood was sometimes spilled. The most immediate danger was aggression. A wolf startled awake by a sudden movement or provoked by the smell of fresh blood could lash out. Archaeologists studying human bones from the Upper Paleolithic have found occasional bite marks consistent with large canids, reminders that not every encounter ended in harmony. For children especially, the risk was high. A wolf pup might grow into a creature too unpredictable to keep close. Yet the pattern of burials, shared shelters, and long-term proximity tells us that people were willing to accept these risks. They learned to read wolf behavior to distinguish the submissive ear flick from the warning growl, the relaxed yawn from the tense baring of teeth. Over time, this mutual literacy reduced conflict, turning what might have been chaos into coexistence. Disease was another hidden danger. Wolves, like all wild animals, carried parasites, infections, and illnesses that could spread to humans. Rabies, though ancient, may not have been as widespread then as in later historical periods, but other zoonotic diseases certainly existed. Fleas and ticks moved easily between species. Intestinal worms could spread through feces. These threats were invisible yet real, making the decision to share space with wolves even more remarkable. And yet, just as humans learned to manage disease among themselves, they must have developed ways to manage it with wolves. Keeping shelters clean, feeding animals away from sleeping areas, perhaps even noticing which wolves appeared healthier and favoring them. Survival required adaptation, and adaptation included tolerating the unseen risks that came with interspecies closeness. Injury was another constant possibility. Wolves are powerful, and even play could be dangerous. A paw pressing against a fragile arm, a playful nip too strong could cause harm. But humans weren't strangers to risk. Their entire lives were filled with sharp edges, flint tools that could slice flesh, fire that could burn, prey animals that could trample. Risk was not something to be eliminated. It was something to be managed. Wolves were simply another element in this constant balancing act. And just as humans accepted the dangers of fire because its benefits were too great to ignore, they accepted the dangers of wolves for the warmth, protection, and companionship they offered. There was also the risk of betrayal, not in the sense of conscious choice, but in the unpredictability of wild instincts. A wolf might wander back to its pack, leaving humans without their trusted companion. A pack that once lingered peacefully could turn aggressive if hunger gnawed too deeply. Humans lived with this uncertainty every day. Yet the pattern of archaeological evidence shows that instead of abandoning the relationship, people doubled down, continuing to nurture the bond. The logic was simple. Even if some wolves turned hostile, others did not. And those who stayed, who tolerated and trusted, became the foundation for something stronger. Each failure was a lesson, each success a step toward domestication. The persistence of this partnership in the face of such risks tells us something profound about early humans. They were not reckless. They were pragmatic, observant, and adaptive. They knew the dangers of wolves, but they also saw the benefits. And in the calculus of survival, the benefits won. Warmth, protection, hunting, help, companionship. Bees outweighed the teeth, the parasites, the unpredictability. By choosing to embrace wolves despite the risks, humans demonstrated a remarkable willingness to gamble on trust. A gamble that would change the destiny of both species forever. And in the next part, we'll explore how the rhythm of the seasons shaped this relationship. why the bitter grip of winter drew humans and wolves closer, and why summer often loosened that bond. The Ice Age year was not a flat, unchanging stretch of cold. It was a cycle of extremes, each season shaping human life in different ways. Summer, brief as it was, brought abundance. Rivers surged with fish. Herds migrated across open plains. Berries and plants offered their fragile bounty. In those warmer months, humans needed wolves less. Fire was still vital, but nights were less deadly and fur less essential. The partnership between humans and wolves never disappeared in summer, but it softened, becoming looser. Wolves might range farther from camps, hunting on their own or with their packs. Humans, meanwhile, had more options, more food, more light to guide them. Winter was the true crucible, the season that stripped life down to its essentials and made the bond not just convenient, but indispensable. When winter arrived, everything tightened. Food grew scarce, the days shortened, and nights seemed endless. Snow buried plants, froze rivers, and muffled the sound of prey animals moving across the land. It was in this scarcity that wolves and humans found themselves drawn back together. For humans, wolves were heaters, guards, and allies in the hunt. For wolves, humans meant scraps, fire, and protection against larger predators. The partnership wasn't romantic. It was forged in necessity. Each winter reforged the pact, renewing trust through shared survival. Every year, as the cold closed in, the two species relearned that they were better together than apart. This seasonal rhythm may explain why wolves became such enduring figures in human culture. They were not constant presences in the same way as fire or stone tools, but seasonal ones whose importance peaked when survival was hardest. That pattern carved itself into human memory. When people told stories around the fire, it was the winters they remembered most. The wolves lying at their sides, the howls echoing through snow-filled valleys, the moments when warmth and safety seemed impossible without them. Summer was freedom. Winter was dependence, and it was dependence that bred trust, reverence, and myth. For wolves, too, the cycle mattered. In summer, prey was plentiful, and they could thrive without humans. But winter tested them just as harshly. Herds migrated. Game became harder to catch, and the energy cost of surviving the cold rose sharply. Human camps with their fires and leftovers became lifelines. Wolves that lingered near people in winter were more likely to survive and raise pups come spring. Over generations, this seasonal association may have selected for wolves more inclined toward human proximity, further driving the evolutionary path toward domestication. In this sense, winter was not just the backdrop of the bond. It was its engine. The shift between seasons also shaped human perception of wolves. In summer, they were competitors again, rival hunters, seen on distant plains. In winter, they were partners, protectors, even companions in the most intimate space of all, sleep. This duality reinforced their place in myth and culture as lineal beings. Sometimes threatening, sometimes saving, always present on the edge of human life. They embodied the ambiguity of nature itself, harsh yet generous, dangerous yet necessary. For early humans who lived without clear divisions between the practical and the symbolic, wolves perfectly captured the shifting nature of survival. By the time humans had endured countless cycles of summer freedom and winter dependence, the bond had become ingrained. Winter after winter, wolves proved their value, and humans proved their willingness to trust. The cycle was self-reinforcing. The harsher the winter, the closer the two species drew, and the closer they drew, the more permanent the bond became. And in the next part, we'll explore how wolves stepped beyond survival entirely, entering the spiritual sphere of shamanism, dreams, and ritual, as companions of the soul as much as the body. To live with wolves was to live with mystery. Their howls pierced the night like voices calling from another world, echoing across valleys with a resonance that seemed more spirit than sound. For Ice Age humans whose lives were saturated with symbolism and spirituality, wolves could not remain simply practical allies. They were too uncanny, too lineal, too powerful to be contained by mere function. Slowly they entered the realm of the sacred. They became companions not only of flesh but of spirit. Woven into the practices of shamans and the visions of dreamers who saw in them a bridge between the human and the wild. Shamanic traditions found across many early cultures often drew on animals as guides, teachers, or intermediaries with unseen forces. Wolves, with their fierce loyalty, uncanny senses, and nightly presence in human shelters were natural candidates for this role. A shaman might don a wolf pelt, believing that in doing so they absorbed the creature's strength, speed, and perception. Dreams, already colored by the sensation of wolves lying close, became filled with images of running in packs, of hunting through snow, of howling at the moon. For those who mediated between the human world and the spirit world, the wolf was a perfect companion, both feared and revered, both familiar and otherworldly. The wolf's dual nature made it especially powerful in symbolic terms. It was predator and protector, destroyer and guardian, wild yet increasingly domesticated. To sleep beside such a being was to embrace contradiction, to accept danger as comfort, to welcome the wild into the heart of human life. Shamans who thrived on mediating contradictions must have seen wolves as kindred spirits. Archaeological finds of wolf skulls placed carefully in ritual contexts, sometimes painted, sometimes arranged with care, suggest they were used in ceremonies meant to channel their power. These were not casual remains. They were sacred objects, instruments for contacting forces beyond the ordinary. The role of wolves in ritual may also have extended into rites of passage. A boy becoming a hunter might be told stories of the wolf as a guide, a model of courage and endurance. To dream of a wolf could be interpreted as a sign of strength or destiny. A girl entering adulthood might be associated with the wolf's protective fierceness, its ability to nurture pups with unyielding devotion. These symbolic associations were not limited to survival. They shaped identity, gender roles, and social meaning. Wolves, in short, became mirrors through which humans understood themselves. Even in death, wolves carried spiritual weight. Burials where wolves were interred with humans likely reflected not just companionship, but belief in shared journeys beyond life. To place a wolf beside the dead was to send them into the next world with a guide, a protector, perhaps even a fellow traveler of the soul. Later traditions across cultures preserved this idea. From the Turkic legends of wolf ancestors to Norse tales of wolves at the side of gods, the theme echoes. Wolves are not merely animals, but companions of destiny, guardians at thresholds, beings that connect the mortal to the eternal. These myths may all trace their ancestry back to those first nights when wolves and humans slept side by side, their breath mingling in the frozen dark. By the time wolves had entered the spiritual imagination, the partnership had expanded beyond survival into meaning. They were no longer just guardians of camps. They were guardians of souls, protectors in both life and dream. To sleep beside a wolf was to be warmed in body and spirit, to be reassured not only of survival, but of purpose. And in the next part, we'll explore the sensory world of those nights. The sounds, the silences, the symphony of howls and breaths that shaped the atmosphere of life with wolves in the Ice Age. Night in the Ice Age was never truly silent. Even in the deepest winter, when snow blanketed the land and smothered sound, life announced itself in subtle rhythms. The crackle of the fire, the hiss of a log collapsing into embers, the sigh of wind slipping through cracks and stone, all of it created a living soundtrack. And then layered over these sounds came the presence of wolves. Their low growls, their steady breathing, their restless shifting of paws against stone or hide added another register to the human ear. For our ancestors, drifting off to sleep meant being enveloped in this symphony of survival, a mixture of human and animal sounds that blurred the line between family and wildness. The heartbeat of the night was shared, steady, and communal. Perhaps the most iconic of these sounds was the howl. Wolves howled for many reasons. To communicate across distances, to call their pack together, to announce territory to humans, though the howl was something more, heard from within a shelter. It could be both haunting and comforting. A wolf outside, lifting its head toward the moon, announced not only its presence, but its vigilance. For Ice Age humans who had come to rely on wolves as guardians, the howl might have become a lullaby of sorts, a reassurance that the camp was not alone in the dark. Even today, people describe the sound of wolves as both eerie and beautiful, a paradox that must have resonated even more powerfully for those who live cheek by jowl with them. Closer to the fire, the sounds were more intimate. The soft huff of a wolf settling down, the muffled thump of its body against packed earth, the occasional snore or yawn. These would have been as familiar as the breathing of a child or the murmurs of a dozing elder. Such noises blurred into the nightly fabric of life. Unremarkable yet essential. They meant the wolves were there alive, part of the collective body that generated warmth and safety. A sudden growl or the scrape of claws against stone could snap everyone to alertness. But just as quickly, the return to steady breathing restored calm. Over time, humans must have come to read these sounds like a second language, knowing when to ignore them and when to grasp their spears. Silence was another sound altogether, and one that carried its own weight. When wolves fell utterly quiet, ears prick-cricked and bodies stiff, humans knew instinctively that something was wrong. This absence of noise, the gap in the expected rhythm, was a warning more potent than a growl. It meant danger was near, a predator stalking just beyond the firelight or an unfamiliar scent drifting through the snow. To live with wolves was to learn that silence could be louder than any cry. This attentiveness to pauses, to absences, honed human perception of the environment, sharpening instincts in ways that extended beyond the immediate bond with wolves. The interplay of sound and silence created a nightly drama that shaped human psychology. To fall asleep to the chorus of wolves breathing, growling, and howling was to be cradled in a cocoon of vigilance. The world outside remained dangerous, but inside the shelter, the soundscape told another story of warmth, of watchfulness, of shared survival. This atmosphere of auditory security may explain why the bond endured. Humans not only felt safer with wolves, they heard safety in their very presence. The sound of a wolf beside you was as comforting as the crackle of fire or the murmur of a parent's voice. By the time generations had passed, the soundscape of nights with wolves was etched into memory and myth. Howls became symbols of wilderness and mystery. Growls warnings of protection, silence, and omen of threat. These associations echo across cultures even today. Proof that the human imagination was shaped by those Ice Age nights. And in the next part, we'll explore how wolves entered the symbolic worlds of early myths across different cultures, carrying forward the echoes of those sounds into the stories that endured long after the Ice Age ended. The myths of wolves are some of the oldest in human memory, and they stretch across continents, suggesting that their roots lie deep in the Ice Age bond. To the people who once shared shelters with wolves, their presence was never neutral. They were too powerful, too enigmatic, too ever-present to be ignored. When stories were told to explain the world, its dangers, its mysteries, its cycles of life and death, wolves naturally stepped into the role of symbol. They were not just animals. They were guides, enemies, ancestors, spirits. And in this symbolic life, wolves preserved the echoes of those freezing winters when their bodies warmed human children and their howls stitched the night with vigilance. In Eurasia, wolves appear again and again as ancestral figures. Turic and Mongolic traditions speak of clans descending from wolves, their very blood tied to the strength and endurance of the animal. This theme makes sense when viewed through the lens of Ice Age survival. A people who lived because wolves shared warmth and protection would naturally come to see themselves as kin. To claim wolf ancestry was to honor that bond, to embed it into identity itself. Across Siberia, shamans wore wolf skins in ritual, invoking not only their power but their closeness. These weren't distant symbols. They were intimate ones, reflecting daily realities of shared life. In Europe, echoes of this bond appear in myths that survived into classical times. The Roman tale of Romulus and Remus raised by a she-wolf is perhaps the most famous, but it is far from unique. Earlier Indo-European traditions link wolves to guardianship, transformation, and ferocity. Warriors were often likened to wolves. Their loyalty to the pack mirrored in loyalty to the tribe. These myths weren't inventions from thin air. They were continuations of an Ice Age reality in which wolves guarded humans in the night and hunted beside them by day. To imagine a child raised by wolves was not fantasy. It was a symbolic retelling of something people had once felt possible. Among Native American traditions, too, wolves occupy a sacred place. Though these myths formed thousands of years after the first migration into the Americas, they likely carried echoes of earlier bonds. Many tribes viewed wolves as teachers of hunting, models of endurance, and guides to the spirit world. The Pony revered the wolf as a creator figure, while the Navajo saw it as a guardian spirit. These themes echo those of Eurasia, suggesting that the bond between humans and wolves was carried across continents, embedded so deeply in human culture that it survived even when separated by oceans and millennia. What unites these myths across cultures is the duality of the wolf, both feared and revered, both dangerous and protective. This duality is the heart of their power as symbols. Humans never forgot that wolves could kill, but they also never forgot that wolves had saved them. To embody contradiction is to embody truth, and wolves became the perfect vessel for expressing the complex reality of survival. Myths crystallized these contradictions into narratives, preserving them long after the Ice Age had ended. In stories, wolves became more than animals. They became embodiment of memory, of the nights when their fur pressed against human skin and their howls carved meaning out of darkness. By the time wolves had become figures of myth, their role in human life was secure. They were no longer just creatures of the Ice Age. They were companions of the imagination, protectors of the spirit, and mirrors of humanity itself. And in the next part, we'll return to the human side of the bond, exploring how living with wolves shaped not only survival and culture, but also human evolution itself, influencing the way our species developed biologically and socially. When we think of human evolution, we often picture stone tools, fire, and language as the driving forces that pushed our species forward. But hidden within that story may be another influence, the wolf. For tens of thousands of years, humans and wolves shared shelters, hunts, and sleep. That kind of intimacy doesn't just change daily life. It reshapes the way a species adapts. Wolves may have influenced the very course of human development, altering how we lived, how we thought, and even how we evolved biologically. The bond was not one-sided. It was a coevolution, a dance between two predators whose destinies became entangled so deeply that one cannot be fully understood without the other. Social evolution was the most obvious arena of influence. Wolves modeled pack behavior in ways that reinforced the importance of cooperation, loyalty, and hierarchy. Humans already lived in groups, but watching wolves and surviving alongside them may have sharpened these instincts. Anthropologists suggest that humans became more cohesive, more disciplined, and more attuned to group dynamics through these interactions. The wolf pack offered a living example of how unity produced strength. Sleeping beside wolves, trusting them as guardians, reminded humans nightly that survival was never an individual endeavor. It was a collective one. In this sense, wolves reinforced the very traits that made humans successful as a species. Biologically, the influence may have been subtler, but still significant. Living so closely with wolves exposed humans to new bacteria, parasites, and diseases, forcing immune systems to adapt. Over generations, this constant sharing of pathogens could have shaped human biology, strengthening resilience in ways we still carry. There is also evidence that early dogs influenced human diets by consuming bones and scraps that humans could not digest. Wolves cleaned camps and reduced waste, indirectly lowering the risk of disease. Later, protodogs would help humans hunt more effectively, increasing protein intake and improving survival. In this way, wolves may have nudged human populations toward greater health, resilience, and expansion. Cognitively, the influence is even more profound. To live with wolves required humans to interpret non-human signals, subtle shifts in body language, vocalizations, and behavior. This constant practice in cross-species communication may have sharpened human minds, expanding the ability to read emotions, predict intentions, and cooperate across boundaries. Some scholars argue that this interaction contributed to the development of empathy itself, extending the circle of care beyond one's immediate kin. A child who learned to trust a wolf's growl as warning or to read the relaxation in its posture was practicing a skill that translated into human relationships as well. Wolves may have helped train humans to become better at being human. There's also the question of expansion. When humans spread into harsher climates, wolves may have tipped the balance of survival. Their warmth, protection, and hunting partnership enabled people to thrive in regions that might otherwise have been uninhabitable. This expansion altered human evolution by placing populations in new environments, forcing further adaptation to cold, to new diets, and to novel challenges. In this sense, wolves weren't just companions. They were catalysts, making it possible for humans to push boundaries and survive where they might not have alone. By the time domestication was well underway, wolves had already left their mark on human evolution. They had shaped our societies, influenced our biology, sharpened our cognition, and expanded our horizons. The bond was no longer an accident of circumstance. It was a driving force in the story of Homo sapiens. And in the next part, we'll begin to draw the threads together, exploring how this Ice Age partnership set the stage for one of the most extraordinary transformations in history, the birth of the domestic dog. By the closing millennia of the Ice Age, the relationship between humans and wolves had already crossed a threshold. What began as fragile tolerance around the firelight had deepened into partnership, then into kinship, and finally into transformation. The wolves who slept beside humans were no longer quite wolves in the wild sense. Their temperaments had shifted, their bodies had begun to change, and their instincts had bent toward coexistence. At some point along this winding path, the line blurred entirely, and what emerged was something new, the domestic dog. It was not a single moment, not the work of one tribe or one generation, but the slow culmination of countless winters of trust. Domestication was never deliberate in the way we think of it today. No ancient hunter set out with the intention of turning wolves into dogs. Instead, it was a long, slow process of natural selection driven by necessity and reciprocity. The calmer wolves were tolerated near camps. The aggressive ones were killed or driven off. The wolves that approached with lowered posture and wagging tails found food and safety. Those that snarled or bit found death. Over time, these small pressures sculpted a population that was subtly different until those who lingered at the edges of firelight were no longer truly wild. They were something else. Proto-dogs, carrying the first hints of the companions that would one day guard our homes, herd our flocks, and sit at our feet. Archaeological sites bear witness to this transformation. The Bonhoeffer Castle burial in Germany, where a proto-dog was laid to rest with humans, shows that by 14,000 years ago, the bond had already become inseparable. Genetic studies pushed the timeline back even further, suggesting divergence from wolves as early as 20,000 to 30,000 years ago. These animals were not yet the sleek breeds we know today, but they were recognizably different from wolves. Shorter snouts, smaller teeth, more varied coats, and above all, more tolerant personalities. Their presence in human burials signals that they had crossed into the human family in every sense that mattered. They were no longer outsiders. They were us. The rise of dogs reshaped human life. They were more than just heaters and guards now. They became active participants in daily survival. Dogs helped hunt, tracking prey with noses sharper than any human eye. They carried loads, hauling supplies in simple travois or packs. They defended camps, barking and growling at strangers long before humans detected them. And perhaps most importantly, they became companions, creatures of affection, as well as utility. The line between necessity and love blurred until dogs were valued not only for what they did, but for what they were. This was a leap as profound as the domestication of fire or the invention of tools, a partnership that redefined what it meant to be human. What made this transformation so remarkable was that it was mutual. Just as wolves became dogs, humans too were changed. Our societies adapted to include animals, not just as resources, but as family. Our psychology expanded to encompass bonds across species, nurturing empathy that would later extend to the domestication of sheep, goats, cattle, and horses. The leap that began with wolves opened the door to an entirely new way of living, one where humans no longer stood alone, but surrounded themselves with allies of every shape and size. Wolves were the first step, and they were the hardest, for they were predators. Once trust had been forged with them, everything else seemed possible. By the end of this transformation, the Ice Age nights that once echoed with the growls of wolves now held the softer sounds of dogs curled in sleep beside their human families. The story that began with fear and necessity had blossomed into something enduring, something woven into the DNA of both species. Humans and dogs had co-evolved, reshaping one another in ways neither could have anticipated. And in the next and final part, we will close this long journey by reflecting on what those nights of shared survival truly meant, not only for cavemen and wolves, but for the entire arc of human history. The story of humans and wolves in the Ice Age is not just about survival in the cold. It is about the courage to trust across species lines, to invite the wild into the most vulnerable space of all, the place of sleep. Each night spent beside a wolf was a gamble, but it was also a step toward something greater. Out of those winters came not only warmth and protection, but one of the most profound partnerships in history. What began as a desperate act of survival became a bond that reshaped human life, culture, and even biology. And though thousands of years have passed, the echoes of those nights still live on every time a dog curls beside us. Every time a howl rises in the distance and stirs something ancient in our bones, it is humbling to imagine the first child who fell asleep against the body of a wolf, their small hand tangled in its fur, their parents too exhausted to intervene, their survival hinging on trust. It is humbling, too, to picture the first hunter who shared scraps not with fear but with acceptance, knowing that generosity might be repaid with loyalty. These moments, small and unremarkable in themselves, were the sparks that lit the fire of domestication. They remind us that history is not only made in grand inventions or battles, but in quiet acts of bravery, in the choice to reach out rather than retreat. The wolves, too, took risks. They stepped closer to the fire, closer to a species as dangerous to them as they were to us. They tolerated the unpredictable movements of children, the smoke of fires, the clatter of tools. They gave up some of their wildness in exchange for trust. And in doing so, they changed their destiny as much as humans did. They became dogs, companions, kin. They traded the endless uncertainty of the hunt for the steadier rhythm of shared survival. And perhaps in their own way, they gained as much as we did: safety, food, and a place in the heart of another species. What those nights created was more than a partnership. It was a blueprint for cooperation, a lesson that survival can be found not only in competition but in alliance. Wolves taught humans to see beyond fear, to recognize kinship where none seemed possible. That lesson shaped societies, myths, and histories, carrying forward into every culture that remembered wolves as ancestors, guardians, and guides. Even now, when we no longer depend on them for warmth or vigilance, the bond remains. Our dogs sleep at our feet, not because we need them to, but because it is what we have always done. It is memory made habit, habit made tradition. And so when you picture cavemen sleeping with wolves during freezing winters, do not imagine only a practical arrangement of warmth and protection. Imagine the spark of something larger, the birth of trust, the weaving of myth, the beginning of a companionship that would outlast the Ice Age itself. Those nights were not just about surviving one more sunrise. They were about creating a future in which humans would never again be truly alone. Wolves gave us more than warmth. They gave us the possibility of friendship beyond our species, the first proof that we could find family in the wild. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the Ice Age nights, through fire-lit caves and bone shelters, through myth and science, through the fragile but enduring bond of cavemen and wolves. If you've listened all the way here, I'd love for you to subscribe, to share your thoughts, and to tell me where in the world you are listening from, and maybe even what time it is for you right now. I think it's beautiful that across thousands of years, we are still sharing stories by firelight, though now it's digital screens instead of caves. Until the next story, may you find warmth, trust, and perhaps the echo of a distant howl to remind you of the wolves who once slept beside.